Hey friends, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we slow things down, dim the drama, and gently wander through the odd, overlooked corners of the past. If you've had a long day, or just need something mildly educational to lull you into sleep, you're in the right place. Tonight's journey begins with a hopping mystery. In the late 1700s, British explorers landed in a land so unfamiliar, the animals looked like they were drawn by committee. One creature in particular, tall, pouch-bellied, and inexplicably bouncy, left Europe's best scientists scratching their powdered wigs. Was it a two-headed deer, a giant rat, a prank, or a reminder that the world is always stranger than the textbooks suggested? So grab a blanket, find your comfiest pillow, and let your mind drift as we ease into the peculiar story of how kangaroos confused the entire European naturalist establishment for decades. Kangaroo confusion, the marsupial that baffled European creature with two heads. Let us drift back to the late 18th century. Picture the hazy deck of a Royal Navy vessel, the Endeavour, swaying gently in a calm Pacific current. The sails hang with a lazy grace, catching enough wind to nudge the ship forward through unexplored waters, at least unexplored by Europeans. The air is thick with salt and curiosity. Below deck, the humidity clings to paper and ink, and a soft scratching sound quill against parchment echoes faintly. Joseph Banks, the young and enthusiastic naturalist aboard the ship, is taking notes. You are there with him. Banks squints at an animal he has just seen hop across the plains of eastern Australia, or New Holland as some maps of the time label it. It does not walk, it bounces, and its legs so very large and the tiny forearms. Its gait is unlike anything he's seen. Its head rises up to sniff the air, and behind it, another, smaller head pokes from a pouch. He is witnessing a kangaroo, but he doesn't know the word yet, nor does he understand the creature before him. The indigenous Australians had hundreds of years of understanding, observation, and names for it, names like kangaroo, a gugu yimithia word, but to Banks and his crew, the kangaroo is a puzzle sent from a dream. In the centuries leading up to this encounter, European naturalists had catalogued much of what they knew with a certain confidence. Linnaeus's Systema Naturae had given order to the animal kingdom. There were four-legged beasts, two-legged birds, slithering reptiles, buzzing insects, and fish. Everything could be placed, but what category did a creature like this belong in? It had the face of a deer, the posture of a bird, the tail of a rat, and the movements of a spring. And it had a pocket for a baby. That alone raised eyebrows and inked sketches in the margins of journals for years to come. When Banks and his colleagues returned to England in 1771, they brought with them more than pressed plants and seashells. They brought confusion. In London drawing rooms and lecture halls, the kangaroo became a soft obsession. One early sketch circulated among naturalists showed the animal's profile in painstaking detail, down to the musculature of its massive hind legs, but the pouch. Some dismissed it as artistic embellishment, others thought it was some sort of abdominal deformity, and the name kangaroo was quickly adopted, though tales would later spread that it meant "I don't know" in the Aboriginal Tonga story that has since been debunked, though it was repeated for decades by those wishing to highlight colonial miscommunications. The early descriptions by Banks, though detailed, were still tentative. He noted that the kangaroo moved only by hopping, that it carried its young, that it had no known predators in this part of the land, but he could not determine how to classify it. Thus began one of the oddest taxonomical debates in Enlightenment Europe. In Paris, a group of natural philosophers met over tea and candles in paneled rooms to ponder this beast. They debated whether it was more akin to the lemur or perhaps a cousin of the opossum, known from the Americas. Others still suggested it must be a member of the rodent family. Its long teeth, after all, seemed vaguely familiar by the 1790s. British artists were including kangaroos in paintings next to lions, ostriches, and elephants, exotic animals that stirred the imagination and represented Britain's global reach. A now famous oil painting by George Stubbs in 1772 shows a kangaroo stiffly posed against a sparse landscape. The animal appears thoughtful, almost human in its solemnity. But there was one small problem: Stubbs had never seen one alive. He had painted the kangaroo based solely on a preserved skin, and Banks's rough sketches. The result was something oddly stilted and alien. And so, for years, Europeans believed kangaroos might be nocturnal deer, or giant jumping mice, or spiritual symbols brought to life. Meanwhile, back in Australia, the kangaroo lived its life, unbothered by the confusion it sowed abroad. In the grassy plains and eucalyptus groves, it grazed and nursed and bounced in the twilight hours. Aboriginal knowledge of the kangaroo, its breeding cycles, behavior, spiritual significance remained rich, intact, and unrecorded by the Europeans who encountered them. It wasn't until more kangaroo specimens, live ones, were transported to Europe that the true strangeness of the animal came into focus. These early captives were met with awe and a certain skepticism. Some Londoners claimed the animals were hoaxes, stitched together from other beasts like sideshow chimeras. Eventually, anatomical studies proved the pouch to be functional, the hopping real, and the creature entirely natural. But the question lingered in polite society for decades. How could a creature so improbable exist at all? And, more quietly still, what else lived in lands so far away, unknown to our maps, our categories, and our imaginations? Classifying the unclassifiable, let us gently pick up where we left off on the candlelit desks of 18th century Europe, where scholarly minds tried to make sense of a creature that bounced instead of walked, suckled young from a built-in pouch, and refused to fit any of the tidy Latin names in their beloved taxonomies. You are now seated, quietly, in a chilly room lined with bookshelves and glass display cases. A group of men in powdered wigs and embroidered waistcoats stand around a table. On the table is a kangaroo pelt flattened, preserved, and oddly lifeless. Its long tail curls unnaturally to one side. The group stares, argues gently in Latin, and makes quill notes on parchment that will become dusty footnotes in future encyclopedias. To them, the kangaroo is more than just a curiosity. It is a challenge. In the years following Joseph Banks' first written descriptions, the intellectual elite of Europe debated the creature's proper place in the natural order with nearly theological intensity. At the heart of the debate was a simple but frustrating issue. The kangaroo didn't fit. It did not follow the rules. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist and father of modern taxonomy, had died in 1778, just before the European world began truly grappling with Australian fauna. His followers took up the task of applying his binomial classification to the kangaroo, but they struggled. It had molars like a herbivore, incisors like a rodent, and reproductive habits that might as well have come from a fairy tale. When more detailed reports and eventually full specimens arrived, in Europe, they still didn't help much. Early British anatomists dissected the creatures with a mix of fascination and alarm. The pouch, they confirmed, was real. But stranger still was the fact that newborn kangaroos called joeys were born absurdly small and underdeveloped, and then crawled into the pouch to continue growing. That was unthinkable in European zoology. There were animals that laid eggs, there were animals that birthed live young, but this was somewhere in between, or perhaps entirely outside the spectrum. And so, for a time, kangaroos hovered in a scientific limbo. Some placed them with opossums, also known for their pouches. Others speculated they were a type of deer that had suffered a mutation or geographic isolation. One particularly confident French scholar even declared the kangaroo a joke of nature, which, for the record, was not meant kindly. The term marsupial didn't gain common use until the early 1800s, derived from the Latin marsupio, meaning pouch. It became a catch-all for this odd category of animals that carried their young outside the womb in built-in handbags. Today, it seems obvious, but at the time it was a radical reframing of how reproduction could work in mammals. In 1798, British scientists gave the kangaroo its first official Linnaean name, Macropus giganteus, meaning giant Bigfoot, a name chosen more for its awkward legs than its awkward taxonomic placement. And yet, even with a name and a growing number of stuffed specimens in museum cabinets across Europe, the confusion did not end. There were still whispers in academic circles. Were kangaroos the only marsupials, or were there others hidden in the vast, little-known landscapes of Terra Australis? Indeed, there were wallabies, wombats, bandicoots, quokkas. Each new animal that trickled into Europe seemed designed to personally insult enlightenment or orderliness. Some looked like miniature kangaroos, others resembled bears or rodents. All shared the trait of external baby carrying. For naturalists raised on tidy lists and anatomical symmetry, it was almost too much. Meanwhile, in Australia, the indigenous peoples had no such confusion. To them, kangaroos were a part of a long and continuous understanding of the land. They knew their habits, their migrations, their mating seasons. Some peoples hunted kangaroos for meat, used their hides for warmth, and even carved their images into rock walls and ceremonial items. Yet these voices were rarely consulted, let alone recorded by the naturalists who attempted to discover what had already been known for thousands of years. Back in London, Joseph Banks, though aging, remained fascinated with the kangaroo and continued to collect reports and samples. He funded voyages and encouraged colonial governors to send more detailed accounts. At his urging, live kangaroos were eventually imported and kept in British menageries and royal gardens. One of the earliest public displays was at the Royal Menagerie at the Tower of London, where visitors paid a modest fee to see a kangaroo hop awkwardly about an enclosure. The public found the animal equal parts enchanting and hilarious. Children pointed and laughed. Artists sketched them for bookplates in scientific journals. Some even appeared in satirical cartoons, often with powdered wigs or monocles, subtly poking fun at both the animal and the scientists who studied it so seriously. In one 1805 London newspaper, a letter to the editor proposed likely in jest that Parliament consider appointing a kangaroo to the House of Lords, as it had more bounce and fewer scandals than some peers. The fascination continued to grow, but questions remained quietly murmured between scholars and whispered in correspondence. Why had no one known of these animals before? How many other worlds existed beyond Europe's tidy maps and theories? And what did it mean that an entire continent's worth of fauna had evolved along a separate, stranger path? In time, the kangaroo came to symbolize Australia itself, a kind of living emblem of the land's otherness. But before it became a tourist-friendly mascot or appeared on coins and postage stamps, it was a genuine zoological riddle, and for decades, Europe's most respected minds debated, dissected, and, on more than one occasion, simply gave up and changed the subject. Because in the end, the kangaroo wasn't wrong, it just didn't care to follow Europe's rules. But this raised an even deeper question, one that science couldn't quite answer at the time. If one animal could reshape the boundaries of known biology, what else was out there, still unknown, quietly hopping just beyond the edge of the map? A symbol, a specimen, and a soft revolution. By the early 19th century, the kangaroo had been formally described, taxonomically classified, and publicly displayed, and yet, it still retained a peculiar sense of mystery, not because it was misunderstood anymore, but because it had become a symbol of colonial wonder, biological exception, and the limits of European certainty. You find yourself now in a marble-floored gallery in the heart of London's British Museum. The year is 1820. Around you, visitors shuffle quietly in heeled boots and starched collars, peering into glass-fronted cabinets. Behind one such pane you spotted the taxidermied kangaroo. Its glass eyes stare vaguely into space. Its posture is stiff, its pouch empty, but a small brass label beneath it reads, Macropus giganteus, discovered in New Holland, collected by Sir Joseph Banks. A young boy presses his nose to the glass and whispers, that can't be real, but it was. And it changed how people thought about the world. The kangaroo wasn't the only Australian creature to append European science, of course. The platypus, discovered around the same time, was so bizarre that when the first specimen arrived in London, scientists suspected a hoax. They examined the seams to check whether a duckbill had been sewn onto a beaver. But the kangaroo, unlike the platypus, was visible, big, mobile, public. It was paraded in enclosures, painted in fine oils, embroidered on velvet waistcoats. Even Jane Austen mentions them in her letters, noting that a friend's household had recently acquired a stuffed kangaroo. This was no longer a matter of dry taxonomy. It was a cultural fascination. In the colonies, the animal's fate was more complex. As European settlers expanded across the continent, kangaroos went from marvel to nuisance. They were hunted for meat, for sport, and later, to protect farmland. Roads and cities disrupted their habitats. Their sacred role in indigenous stories was dismissed or erased. Yet somehow, kangaroos persisted, adaptable, elusive, and just, unusual enough to resist easy domestication. In Europe, meanwhile, kangaroo memorabilia became fashionable among the upper classes. Porcelain figurines, lithographed prints, walking sticks carved with tiny kangaroo heads. For a time, no drawing room in polite society felt complete without some nod to Australia's bouncing mystery. But beneath the fads and exhibits, something deeper had begun to shift. The kangaroo, without intending to, had sparked a quiet revolution in how the natural world was understood. It wasn't just that marsupials required a new category. It was that Europe no longer assumed it had seen everything worth seeing before the kangaroo. There was a belief, especially among Enlightenment thinkers, that the world had been mostly mapped, measured, and named, that all animals fell into familiar patterns, that all nature could be catalogued like a library. The kangaroo bounced straight through that assumption. It reminded people gently, amusingly, and with great muscular thighs that the world was bigger, stranger, and far more diverse than anyone had guessed. It embarrassed scientists, amused the public, and quietly poked holes in the colonial idea of complete knowledge. In later years, the kangaroo took on new meanings to Australians. It became a national symbol, appearing on the country's coat of arms and airline logos, even as real kangaroos continued to hop across highways and scrublands. To biologists, it became a model species for studying evolutionary adaptation, and to historians, it became a case study in cultural contact. What happens when one worldview meets another? And neither is quite sure what to do with the facts in front of them. As for the indigenous Australians whose knowledge of the kangaroo had been developed over thousands of years, their insights are finally, slowly, being recognized. Modern biology now studies not only the animal, but also the ecological knowledge systems built around it, how traditional fire management practices shaped kangaroo habitats, how stories encoded ecological cycles, how observation was passed down, not in textbooks, but in songs. All of this, from one quiet animal. So tonight, as you drift further into sleep, picture the plains of eastern Australia. Picture a mob of kangaroosias, that's the term, resting in the shade of eucalyptus trees. One nibbles quietly at the grass, another flicks its ears at the breeze, and a mother, eyes half closed, shelters her joey in the deep curve of her pouch. They are not confused. They are not exotic. They are simply themselves. And in the end, maybe that was the lesson Europe needed most. Not every mystery has to be solved. Some are just meant to hop quietly, gently, just beyond reach. The Persian ice houses in the art of storing winter ice in the desert. Let your mind drift now to a quieter place. The sun hangs heavy over a wide, arid plain. You're standing in ancient Persia somewhere near modern-day Yazdi Earth. Here is the color of sand and old bricks. The sky a blue so sharp it almost hums. The air is dry, breathless, still. And yet, nearby, in the shadow of an ancient dome, there is ice. Actual, glimmering, crackling ice. In the middle of the desert. Welcome to the quietly ingenious world of the Yakshel, the Persian ice house. You may not have heard of them. They're rarely in textbooks or museum gift shops, but for centuries, before refrigeration, before Freon, before electric fans, these were marvels of engineering that let people preserve winter long into the scalding months of summer. Entire blocks of ice harvested or made by moonlight were stored in great domed chambers, carefully constructed from mud, ash, clay, lime, and perhaps a dash of ancient stubbornness. To understand how they worked, you must first understand the priorities of ancient Persia. Water clear, cold, life-giving was not taken for granted. It had to be managed, channeled, cherished. The people of the Iranian plateau mastered Qanat's underground aqueducts that tunneled through hills and valleys to deliver fresh water to cities, villages, and fields. But water wasn't just about drinking or growing crops. It was about comfort, hospitality, ritual. And in a climate where summer heat could reach scorching heights, ice was not just luxury, it was wisdom. Now picture the Yakshel, a tall, bulbous structure rising from the desert floor like a mud brick spaceship. The outer shape is conical, often more than 10 meters tall, with a narrow opening at the top and a thick, insulated base. Inside, the walls are built from Saruja waterproof mix of clay, sand, ash, egg whites, goat hair, and lime. Yes, egg whites. An ancient formula, surprisingly effective, and quite literally airtight. The floor of the ice house sits below ground. For level here, deep in the cool earth, is where the ice would be stored. But how did they get it? In the winter months, Persian engineers used clever methods to create ice, even when temperatures barely dipped below freezing. One technique involved shallow, rectangular pools called ice basins dug alongside tall north-facing walls. These walls blocked sunlight during the day and funneled cool night air downward. During the coldest nights, water would freeze in thin sheets across the surface of these basins. At dawn, workers would carefully collect the ice and haul it to the Yakshel, stacking it in layers and insulating it with straw or sawdust. Block by block, winter was stored, and it stayed. With its thick walls and subterranean floor, the Yak acted as a passive refrigerator. Air circulated gently inside. The upper vents released warm air. The cool air, heavier, stayed trapped below. Incredibly, ice harvested in January could still be served to guests in July. To modern ears, this might sound like a quaint curiosity and neat trick from the dusty shelves of history, but in its time, it was a game changer. Ice meant food could be preserved longer. It meant drinks could be cooled for honored guests. It meant that perishable ingredients, milk, rosewater, fruits could last just a little longer. For elite households and royal courts, ice was a mark of status. But in many cities, Yakshels were communal, built with public funds or through religious endowments. Ice would be distributed during festivals, weddings, or the hottest days of the year. Some towns even rationed it. Each family allowed a certain weight per week, carefully measured and wrapped in cloth to delay melting. You might be wondering what this looked like in practice. Imagine a wedding in ancient Kashan, late June. The sun bears down relentlessly. The bride's relatives bustle in shaded courtyards, preparing sweet rice and lamb with herbs. Suddenly, a servant arrives with a block of ice wrapped in a wool cloth, pulled by a donkey cart from the nearby yak. It's shaved into snow for faluda, frozen dessert of vermicelli and rose syrup. Children cheer. Grandparents smile. And for a brief moment, everyone forgets the heat. That is what the Yakshel offered. Moments of relief. Even joy, in a world without switches, compressors, or plugs. And unlike many other ancient marvels, temples, palaces, or military fortresses, the Yakshel was not built to impress, but to serve. It was functional, cooperative, and quietly elegant in design. The shape wasn't just aesthetic. It reduced wind resistance and maximized thermal insulation. The building materials were local and sustainable, and the entire system ran on natural forces: gravity, evaporation, air pressure, and time. Modern engineers have studied the Yakshel with increasing interest. In fact, some contemporary eco-architects now look to these designs for inspiration. Their principles align with passive cooling techniques: no energy consumption, no moving parts, minimal maintenance, and perhaps most impressively, many of the original Yakshels still stand, hundreds of years after construction. Some have even been restored and reused. But behind all the science and structure is something simpler. A Yakshel was a promise that when the sun grew unbearable, there would still be a sliver of winter waiting underground, a frozen memory guarded by bricks and patience. And yet, as ice grew more accessible through colonial trade, industrial harvesters, and eventually electric refrigeration, the ancient ice house began to fade. New methods replaced the old. Ice could be shipped in. Machines could hum through the night. The quiet domes of Persia were left to crack, crumble, or shelter bats and dust still. In the heat of the desert, if you stand beside the crumbling remains of a yak shell and press your hand to its cool interior, well, you might feel something more than cold. You might feel the echo of a world where summer and winter coexisted by design. But how did these structures come to be? Who conceived them? And what deeper philosophies about balance, nature, and time guided their construction? The engineers, the philosophers, and the ice keepers imagined it's the 5th century BCE, and you're walking through the edge of a Persian town as twilight begins to cool the air. To your right, workers gather around a half-built dome of packed clay and straw. It's wide at the base and narrowing like a pointed cone toward the top, with scaffolding made of palm wood lattice tied with twine. These aren't laborers blindly following instructions. They're engineers artisans with generations of knowledge, laying out the future yak shell brick by brick. The concept of passive cooling may seem modern, but to the Persians, it was rooted in the same ancient logic that guided their architecture, medicine, and even spirituality. Balance. Harmony with the environment wasn't an option, it was essential. So who built the yak shell? The answer is Laird. The lead engineers, often known as Maran, had learned from oral tradition, passed from father to son, sometimes supplemented by texts on geometry and astronomy. The builders understood soil composition and humidity cycles. They knew how to align the structure so that its north wall always remained in shade. They understood how air moved, how sunlight fell, and how bricks absorbed heat. These weren't just craftsmen, they were stewards of local science. But the philosophical roots went even deeper. In Zoroastrian cosmology, one of the oldest belief systems in Persia, balance was not just desirable, but divine. The forces of Asha, order, truth, light, constantly struggled against Druj, chaos, darkness, decay. Maintaining order in the world wasn't just a practical task, it was a spiritual one. To preserve ice in summer, to bring cold to heat, was more than clever, it was virtuous. And so, when you step inside a yak shell, you aren't just entering a clever cooling system, you're stepping into a space built around a worldview. Silence inside is thick, as if the structure holds its breath. The temperature drops not just physically, but emotionally. It is a place of preservation, not just of ice, but of thought. The outer world continues to bustle, markets, courtyards, camel caravans, but here, inside the dome, winter is paused. There's a serenity to that, a lesson, even. But who kept them running? Maintaining a yak shell required more than architecture. It needed an ice master, a man, or sometimes even a guild tasked with monitoring temperature, managing ice harvests, repairing leaks, and distributing rations to the community. These keepers were trusted figures, often exempt from certain taxes, or granted privileges in return for their work. Records from the Safavid period, 16th-18th century, mention contracts issued for ice maintenance and distribution. Some cities even treated the ice supply as a form of civic welfare. In drought years or exceptionally hot seasons, authorities might subsidize ice for poorer families or ration its use to prevent shortages. And remember, this was all happening without electricity, no compressors, no generators, just clay, gravity, and care. One key technique involved ice layering. When ice was brought into the chamber, it was never simply dumped in piles. Instead, it was stacked in thick, even slabs, separated by straw or insulating reeds. These materials helped regulate temperature and prevent melting from contact friction. Meltwater, when it did accumulate, would drain through a carefully designed sloped floor into underground reservoirs, some of which were used later for cooling water or irrigating nearby gardens. In larger cities, yak shells sometimes worked in coordination with canal systems. These ancient aqueducts, dug underground across vast distances, tapped into mountain aquifers and carried cold water downhill using only gravity. The combination of canals and yak shells was an elegant environmental system, water drawn from beneath the earth, frozen by the night, stored under domes, and returned to the people. And it worked. For centuries, visitors from other parts of the Islamic world and even from as far as China or India commented on Persia's cold water in summer, sometimes with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Some wrote of sherbets served on trays of chipped ice. Others described public fountains where children dipped cloths into chilled basins. A 10th century geographer described Shiraz as a city where the heat is baked into the walls, but the drinks are colder than snow. To be clear, this was not ice in the way modern people know it. There were no freezers, no crushed cubes and colorful drinks. But in a world of sand, dust, and unrelenting heat, a basin of half-melted snows into a porcelain dish and laced with sour cherry syrup was the height of both engineering and hospitality. It was a small miracle, one made by hands, not machines. Over time, yak shells became more than just storage facilities. They became landmarks, meeting points. In some villages, they served as communal cool houses during festivals or midday prayer. Children played in their shadows. Vendors set up carts nearby, selling flavored ices in glazed ceramic bowls. And they entered the language too. Persian poets occasionally used the yak shell as metaphor for memory, for restraint, for secrets kept in the heart's deepest vault. "Let not my love melt like ice unwatched," wrote one poet during the Qajar dynasty. Another described his aging father as a man of summer wrapped in yakshal silence. But as with all things, time brought change. European ice began arriving in ports like Bushehr and Bandar Abbas by the lake. Muoyoi to Sentazesi, shipped from northern factories or harvested from frozen lakes in Scandinavia. Imported ice was fashionable, expensive, cleanly cut into angular bricks. It became popular in hospitals and hotels. By the early 20th century, electric refrigeration was introduced, first to elite households, then gradually to the middle class. The idea of ice, once a communal gift carved from the moonlit, cold, became something private, individual, controlled with a dial. And yet in some small towns, the old ways lingered. Even today, if you visit Yazd or Kerman, you might stumble across a restored yak shell, its earthen walls patched, its entryway shaded with reeds. It might be empty now, used for museum tours or afternoon shade. But the structure still speaks. It tells of a time when entire communities worked together to tame the seasons. When ice came not from outlets but from the wind, and when keeping something cold was not a convenience, but an act of shared resilience. But one mystery remains. Who built the very first yak chill, and how did they know it would work? Was it trial, error, a forgotten genius of mud and shadows? The first dome, the last whisper. The question of who built the very first yak chill is lost to time, its answer buried somewhere in the sands of the Achaemenid Empire, perhaps even earlier. No inscription marks the moment. No scroll survives to name the first mind that looked at clay, wind, and night air, and saw the possibility of cold. But someone did. Perhaps it was not a single person at all, but a slow accumulation of knowledge from farmers watching how water froze in shaded irrigation channels, from masons who noticed which materials stayed cool to the touch, from herders who packed snow into underground pits and found it still fresh come summer. There's a particular kind of genius in that slow, collective realization, not the sudden flash of invention, but the quiet curve of attention across centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that early prototypes of yakchals were in use during the Achaemenid period, c. 552-330 BCE, during the time of kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius I. Though those kings are remembered for conquering lands and building palaces, their engineers were just as busy building infrastructure, roads, canals, and, most likely, ice houses. Imagine the first one, crude, perhaps, low to the ground. Maybe half collapsed before the summer ended, but then improved, strengthened, redesigned. A slightly wider dome, a deeper base, thicker walls. Every winter another experiment, every summer another test, until finally someone realized it worked. The earliest full-scale yakchals that survive today date back roughly 400 to 500 years, but they are the descendants of those forgotten firsts. The fact that so many still stand is a tribute not just to their durability, but to their elegance. These were buildings meant to resist time, and now we return to the present. Today, most people reading or listening to this sleep in rooms where a cold drink is never more than a few steps away. Open the refrigerator, press a button, and there it is. Ice automated uniform, humming quietly behind closed doors. It's easy, clean, forgettable, but in this forgetting, something subtle is lost. The ice you hold today is no longer seasonal. It does not require patience. You do not wait for the right night. You do not layer it with straw, or dig through it with a careful hand. And yet, ice still comforts, still cools, still represents a kind of control over the elements in ancient Persia. This control was more delicate. Not domination, but cooperation. Builders didn't fight the desert. They worked with it. They aligned their domes to the stars. They listened to the wind. They timed the pouring of water with the setting of the sun. It was not fast, but it was wise. In that sense, the yaktil was never just a storage container. It was a relationship, handshake with nature, saying, if I move carefully, if I learn your ways, might you let me keep a little bit of winter? Let us imagine one final scene. It is dawn in Yazd, sometime around 1650. The city is stirring. Vendors set up their stalls. Bread rises in clay ovens. And in the northern quarter, a young apprentice barefoot, robed in linen, descends into the cool interior of the local yakshal. He steps carefully. The air grows colder with each breath. He carries a chisel, a wooden mallet, and a bundle of cloth soaked in rose water. Around him, layered blocks of ice glisten in the dim light. He selects one, knocks loose a corner, and wraps it carefully. He'll bring it to the mayor's home, where it will be placed in a ceramic jug and served at breakfast. No one will thank him, but he doesn't mind. His work is not dramatic. It is patient, purposeful, and, in its own quiet way, beautiful. Centuries later, the yakchal remains. Its dome rises like a memory above the desert. Some days it's visited by tourists, other days by no one at all. But if you find yourself standing there, and you place your hand against the wall warm in the sun, cool inside, you may still feel it breathing, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, like the desert, like time, like a sliver of snow waiting, patiently beneath the earth. Because even in a world of microwaves and machines, we still long for balance. for a moment of stillness, for something that reminds us winter can be kept if you know how to ask. A Sumerian clerk's daily grind clay tablets and coffeeless mornings. The sun rises over the ancient city of Ur in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia. Around 2100 BCE, its first light spills over mud brick walls, ziggurats, canals, and rooftop courtyards still quiet from the night. Palm trees sway gently in the breeze of the Euphrates. The air is already warm, and you are a scribe, not a priest, or king, not a hero carved in myth, just a clerk, a professional writer in a city of tens of thousands, one of the earliest urban centers on Earth. Your job isn't glory, it's documentation. There's no coffee to begin your day, no beans, no brew, not even a distant cousin of caffeine. Instead, you wake with a splash of cool water from a clay jug and a piece of flat barley bread, slightly dry at the edges, but nourishing. You chew slowly. It will be a long day. You live in a modest home, perhaps near a courtyard shared with other scribes or artisans. Your sleeping mat is rolled and tucked. You dress simply, a woven wool tunic, dyed with whatever your status allows. Maybe blue or expensive, maybe just undyed beige. Around your waist is a sash where you tuck your stylus, because your true tool, the thing that defines you, is not a sword or plow. It is a reed, cut from the marshes, shaped carefully, hardened in the sun. Its flat edge is perfect for pressing into clay, not drawing, not scratching, but impressing shapes that represent sound, meaning memory. Cuneiform. You step into the narrow alleyways of the smell of date syrup and city dust in the air. Merchants are already setting up their stalls, textiles, beer jars, fish from the river, copper trinkets from distant lands, but you walk past them, turning toward the administrative complex at the edge of the ziggurat plaza. This is where the records are kept, and today you'll be adding more, because everything in Sumer needs recording. Grain transactions, goat births, brick deliveries, temple rations, legal disputes, imports of lapis lazuli from the east, exports of barley to neighbors' apriva, all must be tracked, not for curiosity, but for survival. You enter a chamber with thick walls and small windows high above to keep out the heat. There are no desks, just low benches, and shelves for clay tablets. Some tablets are small and palm-sized for simple messages. Others are thick and heavy, accounting logs for an entire season. You glance at the drying racks. Dozens of tablets from yesterday lined up neatly, the clay hardening in the warm air. Your supervisor, a senior scribe with deeply creased palms, hands you a basket of fresh clay and gestures at a list of accounts. A temple bakery has requested barley. The granary needs to confirm its totals. There's a new trade agreement with the Fishmongers Guild. And there is gossip, of course. Even in the world's first bureaucracy, people talk. You hear whispers about a farmer who's accused a neighbor of redirecting water from an irrigation ditch. You hear that a junior priest tried to overstate the temple's livestock count. These things matter, and Sumer records are the truth, so you sit, roll a piece of clay between your palms, and begin. Your stylus moves methodically, wedge line, space. The script is not alphabetic, but syllabic, a complex system of signs that evolved from pictographs. You know, hundreds of them, more than most people. Being literate in Sumer is not common. It sets you apart. Even nobles sometimes rely on scribes, like you, to read contracts aloud. You pause occasionally to smooth the clay, to scratch your head, to stretch your fingers. Writing is slow. You must be precise. A single error can mean that 10 donkeys are recorded instead of one, or worse, someone loses their barley ration and comes knocking on the clerk's door. Outside, the city hums louder as the day warms. Donkeys bray, wheels creak, bronze tools clink against stone, priests chant, schoolboys recite proverbs in a courtyard. You focus on your lines. You don't think of yourself as a historian, but in a way you are, because 4,000 years later, your tablet might be uncovered by archaeologists, brushed carefully, and placed in a museum under glass. A scholar might translate your precise, beautiful cuneiform and remark, "Here is a receipt for 20 goats delivered to the temple of Nana," and they will marvel, not at the goats, but at you, the unknown clerk who recorded it. But for now, your work is routine. At midday, you take a break, stepping into the shade of the temple corridor. A water carrier passes, sloshing his jug. You eat a handful of dates and some lentil mash wrapped in a fig leaf. Your back aches slightly. You stretch, listening to the dull drone of flies. Then, back to the bench. More clay, more entries. This afternoon's task is more delicate, a legal dispute. A tablet from 2 months ago has been challenged. The parties involved are merchants, both respected, and each has witnesses. You must record a statement carefully, because your words will be final, not law. Exactly, but record. And in Sumer, record is law. So you listen, you write, you keep your expression blank. One man is sweaty, loud, the other calm, smug. You ignore the emotion, you just press symbols into clay. At the end of the day, your fingers are sore, your tunic dusted with dry flakes of earth. You stack your finished tablets on the drying shelf, then bow lightly to your supervisor. He nods back, silently. You walk home at sunset, past vendors packing up, children playing knucklebones in the dust, a harpist tuning her strings near a tavern. You pass the ziggurat, glowing red in the light, and think briefly of how many names are carved into it. It's bricks, not gods, not kings, just builders. Their names preserved not for glory, but for bookkeeping in your home. The mat is unrolled again. You lie back and close your eyes. Today was not heroic. It was not romantic, but it mattered because tomorrow, someone will read what you wrote. They will know where the grain went, who owned which sheep, and when the moon waxed full that season. But what happens when the clerk goes missing, or the temple burns? What survives of a civilization when its records turn to dust? Dust, fire, and the weight of clay. Let the night settle over you now. Oil lamps flicker behind lattice windows. Somewhere a temple drum echoes faintly across the rooftops. You're still that Sumerian clerk, just a day older, but tonight, you can't sleep. You're thinking about the records, not just the ones you etched today, but all the ones from before. The walls lined with tablets, the scrolls of contracts, the ration lists, the festival calendars. You think about how much clay the city has stored, how many thoughts have been pressed into it, dried, and forgotten. You've seen what happens when a record goes missing. A few months ago, a granary ledger was misplaced during a festival. No one could prove who received which barley ration. Tempers flared. One scribe was accused of theft, another of incompetence. You remember him, Tillich, quiet, careful, never a troublemaker. He swore he had double-checked the drying rack, but the tablet was gone. A week later, someone found it near the kill, half-baked and water-damaged. The numbers blurred. The case was dropped. But Tillich stopped showing up after that. You know he didn't steal anything. Still, the record had failed. And in Sumer, when the record fails, memory collapses with it. This is why you take your job seriously. Every wedge you press matters. Not just because it represents grain or goats, but because it represents trust. The temple trusts you, the merchants trust you, even the gods, at least in the eyes of the people, rely on you to document offerings and sacrifices accurately. But clay is fragile and fire is not uncommon. There have been rumors lately, quiet ones, about raids of rival city-states, bandits, water disputes turning violent. You've heard whispers that Uruk's walls were damaged in a skirmish, that one of their temples was looted, that fires reached the record house. You imagine the shelves row upon row of dry, flammable clay tablets consumed in minutes. Words turned to ash, entire seasons worth of trade, taxes, births, and deaths lost. Not lost like a broken pot, lost like it never happened. And that makes you wonder, why is it that so much of Sumer's greatness, its temples, its trade, its kings, depends on you and your colleagues, not on soldiers or priests, but scribes? Why do these little clay bricks hold the weight of the world? Because writing is permanence, not poetry, necessarily, not wisdom, just presence. Proof. The man who pays his debts wants a record. The woman who sells her land needs one. The priest who distributes temple beer demands it. You provide that. And you wonder, will your name ever be recorded? Some are the great scribes, the high officials. Their tablets bear signatures. Sholgimes wrote this, or tablet of Enlil Bani, royal scribe, year the canal was dug. But yours, you glance at your stylus, sitting beside your mat. Probably not. Still, you find some comfort in the idea that long after you're gone, someone may touch your work. Thousands of years from now, perhaps, a scholar in a distant land will pick up your small clay receipt for 10 sheep and whisper, "This is Sumer," but will they know your world? Will they understand the heat of the day, the chalky taste of barley bread, the way your knuckles ache after 12 hours of writing? Will they picture the man behind the tablet or just the data? You drift off. And the years begin to pass by. The second millennium BCE, Sumerian as a spoken language is fading. Akkadian replaces it in the markets and homes, but the scribes still learn Sumerian in school. It's become a sacred language, a scholarly one, much like Latin in later centuries. You, or someone like you, still sits in that same kind of room, same clay, same stylus. But the world is shifting. New powers rise, Babylon grows, yours influence wanes. There are floods, fires, temples crumble, the river shifts, and yet the tablets remain. Not all, of course, many crack, some melt in rain or flood. Some are thrown away when obsolete, but some survive, buried in rubble, baked accidentally in fire, ironic perhaps, that destruction preserved them thousands of years later. Archaeologists will find them. In the 19th century CE, impossibly far in the future, biocalendar men with wide-brimmed hats and pickaxes will dig into the mounds of southern Iraq. They'll find tablets you or your descendants wrote. They'll ship them to museums in London, Berlin, Istanbul. They'll photograph them, decode them, translate them into 100 modern languages. They'll be amazed by the complexity of your records, your mathematics, your legal contracts, your jokes. Use your jokes. Some tablets contain proverbs. One scribe copied, likely from a school tablet. A student who does not listen, his house will be full of broken pots. Another reads, something which has never occurred since time immemorial. Young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. They'll laugh, and in that laughter you will live again. but the mystery will remain. How did a civilization so dependent on memory, so organized, so advanced, vanish so quietly? The last tablet on the shelf. Let us fast forward gently, like sand carried on the wind. The city of yore has changed. The great ziggurat still towers above the flatlands, but its outer bricks have crumbled. What once shimmered with baked clay and bitumen is now faded and cracked. Canals run slower. The markets are quieter. The temples echo more than they chant. It is sometime around 1800 BCE, nearly 300 years after your first day. As a clerk, the scribal school still operates. Children still copy proverbs into wet clay, still whisper rhymes about lazy students and stubborn goats. The stylus remains unchanged, the tablets still dry on racks in the sun. But the world has shifted beneath the feet of these scribes. The language spoken in the streets is now mostly Akkadian. The Sumerian tongue, your tongue's kept alive only by tradition, by practice, by memory. It lives on in schools and in temples, but only just. And you are no longer the clerk. You are now a memory, a trace, a roll passed from one quiet, observant person to the next. Today, the last of your kind in your carefully stacks the city's remaining active records. His tunic is patched, his stylus smooth from years of use. He knows what you once knew, that the heart of a city is not just in its walls or its priests or its soldiers, it is in its records. That's why he hasn't left. Even as the population dwindles and the canals silt up, he continues to catalog shipments of barley. He logs the temple's loan of oxen to a local farmer. He writes out the name of a child newly apprenticed to the Potter's Guild. He knows it may never be read. He knows the king in Babylon no longer sends envoys. He knows the gods of Akkad are taking root where Enlil and Inanna once reigned. And yet, he writes because once the record stops, so does the civilization. That's not a dramatic event. There is no bell that tolls, no invader shouting from the walls, no fire sweeping dramatically through the archive. It's subtler than that. The last record is written, the last tablet placed on the drying rack. Perhaps it logs a batch of reeds delivered for temple repairs, or a ration of beer issued to an aging gatekeeper. It is not poetic, it is not historic, it is enough, and then nothing maybe. The scribe dies, maybe the city is abandoned, maybe a seasonal flood forces the last few families away, and no one returns. Centuries pass, the river changes course, silt buries the city, wind smooths the edges of crumbling walls, roofs collapse, palms grow wild. In the courtyards, generations forget where you once stood, until, thousands of years later, a shovel strikes clay. Archaeologists, brushing delicately with gloved hands, lift up what looks like a chunk of hardened earth. But there are marks, wedges, lines, a stylus's memory. They read the name of a merchant, the date of a lunar festival, the yield of a barley field. They realize, this is not a king's chronicle, it is a ledger, and that ledger is a treasure, because what survives of a civilization is not always its glory but its habit, its pattern, its ordinary moments recorded in cool mud. Your life, your quiet days as a clerk, your repetitive entries, your carefully managed drying racks. They are not lost, they are waiting. In museum drawers, in digital archives, in the whispered amazement of a scholar who reads your tablet aloud and says, softly, he was here, she wrote this, they kept track. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine yourself not as a forgotten clerk but as a quiet witness to a world where writing began, where the weight of civilization was pressed, carefully, into clay, and where even the smallest of records was a kind of prayer, not to a god, but to the future. How Byzantines filed their taxes. The empire of receipts. It is a mild spring morning in Constantinople, somewhere around the year 867 CE. The city wakes not with fanfare or cannon fire, but with the soft tapping of sandals on marble, the groan of opening market stalls, and the rustle of papyrus and parchment. You are, once again, not a general or a noble. You are a logarius, a tax clerk of the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as Byzantium. You work in an office. Not in some metaphorical sense, you work in an actual office, a room, with shelves, and a desk, and far more ink stains than glory. Your empire stretches from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Levanten coast. But none of that really matters to you, because you don't leave the third floor of the fiscal archive building. Your world is papyrus tally charts and the endless pursuit of correct decimal placement. You arrive early. The palace guards nod lazily as you slip past, scrolls tucked under your arm, stylus behind your ear. Your sandals click on the floor worn smooth by centuries of other tax workers just like you, anonymous, indispensable, and utterly ignored. Inside, it smells of old parchment and warm beeswax. You take your seat beneath a high-arched window, its light diffused through fine linen to prevent glare on the ink. Before you are several Bema scrolls, yearly tax rolls listing everything from barley fields in Cappadocia to fishing rights in the Gulf of Nicomad. It is your job to check them, line by line, entry by entry. You must confirm that landowners have paid their due, that tax receipts match their declarations, that wheat has not been mysteriously reclassified as millet to avoid grain tariffs. It has happened before. The Byzantine tax system is not simple. It is in fact gloriously complicated. Centuries of imperial bureaucracy have layered levy upon levy, often without retiring the old ones. Some taxes are calculated in coin, others in kind, olive oil, timber, wine, or military service. You don't just collect revenue, measure people's lives in quantities of cheese, boatloads of salt, or sacks of lentils, to survive in this system. You must be alert, precise, patient, and above all, good at finding errors without upsetting anyone important. You run your fingers over the parchment. One village near Thessaloniki has recorded 12 taxable households, but last year it was 13. A note in the margin says, "The house of Gregorios burned." You sigh. You'll have to confirm this. If Gregorios has moved in with a cousin, he may still owe labor tax. There are no calculators, no ledgers with tidy grids, only neat rows of Greek numerals, complex, symbolic, and easy to miswrite. Your ink is made from soot and gum arabic. Your stylus from reed or quill. You stop occasionally to warm your hands by the brazier. The draft makes your fingers stiffed out at midday. You share bread and olives with your fellow clerks. One of them tells a story about a village priest who claimed all his goats were spiritually exempt. Another snorts and says a noble from Pontus declared his orchard symbolic, and thus not taxable. Everyone laughs. You've heard worse. You eat in silence, mostly, not out of solemnity but concentration. Even lunch is a time for organizing thoughts, which receipts to request, which reports to send, which scribes need reminding to re-ink their seals. After the break, you visit the Logothesian Tegenekutha Central Financial Office of the Empire. It is vast and dusty, lined with cabinets locked by iron latches. The archivist, a round-shouldered man who's been there since Basil I's coronation, opens a drawer for you. Inside, the parchment tax census from 859. You trace the names with your eyes, matching them to the newest scroll. There he is, Gregorios, son of Alexandros, 3 goats, 2 jars of fish oil, 1 bronze pan. Still taxable. You return to your desk and adjust the entry. This is what a day in the life of Byzantine fiscal power looks like. Not soldiers, not banners, not politics, but ink, soot, and scribes hunched over scrolls. And this has been true for centuries, even as emperors rise and fall, even as the Hagia Sophia hosts coronations and revolts. The tax records are kept, and, unlike military campaigns or church sermons, they are not designed to inspire, they are designed to endure, because taxes are not just about money, they are about structure. They keep the roads paved, the cisterns cleaned, the borders defended. You may not wear purple robes, but without you, the robes go unpaid. Still, you wonder sometimes late at night, eyes bleary from squinting over numerals, how this empire holds together at all. So many layers, so many names, so many scribes correcting scribes, and always the question lingers. What happens when no one is left to count? When the scrolls stop unrolling, and the names no longer matter? How Byzantines filed their taxes. Section 1. The Empire of Resitsit is a mild spring morning in Constantinople. Somewhere around the year 867 CE, the city wakes not with fanfare or cannon fire, but with the soft tapping of sandals on marble, the groan of opening market stalls, and the rustle of papyrus and parchment. You are, once again, not a general or a noble. You are Logarius, the tax clerk of the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as Byzantium. You work in an office. Not in some metaphorical sense, you work in an actual office, a room with shelves, and a desk, and far more ink stains than glory. Your empire stretches from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Levanten coast. But none of that really matters to you, because you don't leave the 3rd floor of the fiscal archive building. Your world is papyrus tally charts and the endless pursuit of correct decimal placement. You arrive early. The palace guards nod lazily as you slip past, scrolls tucked under your arm, stylus behind your ear. Your sandals click on the floor worn smooth by centuries of other tax workers just like you, anonymous, indispensable, and utterly ignored. Inside, it smells of old parchment and warm beeswax. You take your seat beneath a high-arched window, its light diffused through fine linen to prevent glare on the ink. Before you are several Bema scrolls, yearly tax rolls listing everything from barley fields in Cappadocia to fishing rights in the Gulf of Nicomad. It is your job to check them, line by line, entry by entry. You must confirm that landowners have paid their due, that tax receipts match their declarations, that wheat has not been mysteriously reclassified as millet to avoid grain tariffs. It has happened before. The Byzantine tax system is not simple. It is in fact gloriously complicated. Centuries of imperial bureaucracy have layered levy upon levy, often without retiring the old ones. Some taxes are calculated in coin, others in kind, olive oil, timber, wine, or military service. You don't just collect revenue, measure people's lives in quantities of cheese, boatloads of salt, or sacks of lentils. To survive in this system, you must be alert, precise, patient, and above all, good at finding errors without upsetting anyone important. You run your fingers over the parchment. One village near Thessaloniki has recorded 12 taxable households, but last year it was 13. A note in the margin says, the house of Gregorios burned, you sigh. You'll have to confirm this. If Gregorios has moved in with a cousin, he may still owe labor tax. There are no calculators, no ledgers with tidy grids, only neat rows of Greek numerals, complex, symbolic, and easy to miswrite. Your ink is made from soot and gum arabic. Your stylus from reed or quill. You stop occasionally to warm your hands by the brazier. The draft makes your fingers stiffed out at midday. You share bread and olives with your fellow clerks. One of them tells a story about a village priest who claimed all his goats were spiritually exempt. Another snorts and says a noble from Pontus declared his orchard symbolic and thus not taxable. Everyone laughs. You've heard worse. You eat in silence, mostly, not out of solemnity but concentration. Even lunch is a time for organizing thoughts, which receipts to request, which reports to send, which scribes need reminding to re-ink their seals. After the break, you visit the Logothesian Degenekutha Central Financial Office of the Empire. It is vast and dusty, lined with cabinets locked by iron latches. The archivist, a round-shouldered man who's been there since Basil I's coronation, opens a drawer for you. Inside, the parchment tax census from 859. You trace the names with your eyes, matching them to the newest scroll. There he is, Gregorios, son of Alexandros, 3 goats, 2 jars of fish oil, 1 bronze pan. Still taxable. You return to your desk and adjust the entry. This is what a day in the life of Byzantine fiscal power looks like. Not soldiers, not banners, not politics, but ink, soot, and scribes hunched over scrolls. And this has been true for centuries, even as emperors rise and fall, even as the Hagia Sophia hosts coronations and revolts. The tax records are kept, and, unlike military campaigns or church sermons, they are not designed to inspire, they are designed to endure, because taxes are not just about money, they are about structure. They keep the roads paved, the cisterns cleaned, the borders defended. You may not wear purple robes, but without you, the robes go unpaid. Still, you wonder sometimes late at night, eyes bleary from squinting over numerals, how this empire holds together at all. So many layers, so many names, so many scribes correcting scribes, and always the question lingers, what happens when no one is left to count? When the scrolls stop unrolling, and the names no longer matter? The empire on paper, the sun has long since dipped behind the walls of Constantinople. Lamps now glow in alcoves. Scribes dip their quills one last time. The marble corridors of the Logothesian are still not from sleep, but from concentration. You are finishing your final entry for the week. Outside, emperors may rise and fall. Generals may trade cities for promises. But in here, the numbers march on. Like the empire itself, the scrolls are still breathing, still accumulating, still holding the whole Byzantine experiment together. There's something almost sacred about it. The walls around you are stacked high with scrolls, some of them curling with age, others still crisp with fresh ink. A few are wrapped in waxed leather cases and sealed with imperial lead tags. You're not supposed to open those. They're part of the secreta, the private imperial accounts. It's said some of them record tax breaks granted to monasteries in return for political favors or dowry payments arranged by the empress herself. Of course, you wouldn't know. You handle the day-2-day. The common man's accounts, the goat tax, the ferry toll, the spice levy on pepper imported from Egypt, and of course, the kapnik on the infamous hearth tax, paid by every household that dared light a fire. You've seen families broken by it. A widow unable to pay might beg for remission. Some dioceses grant it, others don't. Sometimes it depends on the mood of the local official. Sometimes it depends on whether the village scribes are in the right political faction. Because Byzantium, like its records, is layered. The bureaucracy is brilliant, yes, but also delicate, political, occasionally absurd. 1 year, you recall, a distant province sent in a tribute of sheep wool instead of silver. A courier lost the record of the transaction along the route. The wool arrived. The coin did not. The province was fined. Twice. Another time, a man disguised his fishing boat as a religious vessel to avoid the harbor fee. The forgery was elaborate. It worked for nearly 6 months before anyone noticed. That's the danger and the genius of this system. It's so detailed, so sprawling, that mistakes, honest or not, are inevitable. And yet, it endures. Because Byzantium isn't held together by force. It's held together by administration. The Roman Empire in the West fell centuries ago. The legions disbanded. The roads crumbled. But here in the East, the empire continues. Not through conquest, but through ledgers. You glance at your colleague across the chamber. He's sealing a package of scrolls bound for Antioch. He nods at you, tired, but satisfied. Another quarter complete. Another tax cycle filed. Another season of order, secured in ink. As you tidy your desk, you reflect on your career. You never wore armor, never rode into battle, but you served the empire just the same. You maintained its shape. gave it consistency. Your scrolls outlasted generals, your entries outlasted dynasties, and you wonder, as every tax clerk eventually does when the last ledger is closed, when the last seal is broken, what happens to the empire that lived on paper? Centuries later, historians will ask the same. They'll pore over fragments in European libraries, amazed at the detail. A letter from a salt tax official, a complaint about tax evasion in Lesbos, an entire scroll dedicated to the import tolls on saffron. Some will chuckle at the FUSSI and ESS. Others will marvel at the resilience. Few will grasp that this, more than the golden mosaics or jeweled crowns, was Byzantium's true legacy. An empire, not of swords but of scrolls. So tonight, as you lay down your stylus, stretch your hands, and listen to the soft shuffling of sandals on polished stone. Remember this: you kept the empire warm. You lit its lamps. You paid its soldiers, funded its festivals, and bought time for peace, for prayer, for pride. And though no statue will be carved in your name, no fresco painted in your image, your numbers remain. And perhaps, in some dusty archive centuries from now, someone will run a finger along your neat lines and whisper, "This is Byzantium, the lost postal routes of the Inca Empire, Section 1. Messages in the mountains. The year is 1490, and you're standing on a narrow dirt path thousands of meters above sea level. The world is stone, sky, and silence. The Andes rise like the backs of sleeping giants, ridged and vast. Your lungs are used to the thin air barely. Your sandals are tied tight. A small pouch bounces lightly at your side. You are a Chasqui, runner in the service of the Inca Empire. And you have a message to deliver, not on paper, not written, not sealed with wax or penned with quill. The Inca Empire had no alphabet, no scrolls or parchment, but it had communication. It had roads. It had runners. You are one. Ahead of you is a Tamboza way station built of smooth stone. Nestled along the ridge, a red banner flutters to mark its place. Beyond it, another runner waits, ready to receive your cargo. You won't stop for long, just enough to pass the message, sip a bit of chicha, catch your breath, and carry on. The message itself, a quipu, set of knotted cords, coiled like a careful snake in your pouch. To the untrained eye, it's a tangle of threads. But to you, or to an Inca official, it's a sentence, a number, an order, perhaps a count of tribute grain from a distant village, or a summons from the emperor, or news of a distant snowfall that threatens the potato fields. Whatever it is, you don't know. You don't have to. Your job is speed, precision, and silence. You are one runner among thousands. The Inca communication system was the most advanced in the pre-Columbian Americas. No horses, no wheels, no writing. And yet, messages could travel over 1,500 miles in just a matter of days. From Quito to Cusco, from the desert shores of the Pacific to the peaks of the highlands, the secret, the Capicone, the great Inca road, over 24,000 miles of stone-paved routes crisscrossed the empire, connecting cities, villages, shrines, fortresses, and fields. Some ran along mountaintops, others cut through dense jungle. Suspended rope bridges swayed over gorges where no animal dared cross. And along the entire network, spaced like pearls on a thread, where the Tambo's rest stops where Chasqui light, you passed messages along a human relay chain. Some Tambos were simple huts, others were large complexes complete with food storage, guards, and sleeping quarters for administrators. But for the Chasqui, they were waypoints. You rarely lingered. At full speed, a message could travel nearly 150 miles a day. To put that in context, while Spanish messengers in Europe struggled over muddy roads, the Inca had high-altitude couriers, zipping through switchbacks and glacier valleys with the efficiency of a human telegraph. Each Chasqui ran a leg of the route, usually 4 to 9 kilometers before passing the message to the next. Young men trained for years to master breath control, memorization, and mountain sprinting. You were selected for endurance, for loyalty, for legs that barely seemed to touch the ground. You didn't carry much, just the quipu and sometimes a short spoken phrase. You memorized that, too. No written backup, no errors allowed. One misremembered message could mean missed taxes, boiled food, or a village caught unprepared for an imperial visit. But you're not thinking about that right now. Right now, you're thinking about your footfalls, the path ahead, the rhythm of your breath. The Chasqui ahead of you, the one with a red sash tied around his waist, is preparing to sprint. When you arrive, you'll hand him the pouch, exchange a brief nod, and he'll be gone before your sweat cools. You remember your training. Your instructor, a grizzled elder in a feathered headband, once told you, you don't run for yourself, you run for the Sapa Inca. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, the son of the sun. He lives in Cusco, the naval center of the empire, surrounded by golden walls and quiet advisors. But he knows what happens in the fields of Huánuco and the llama pens, of Arequipa and the stone quarries of the Sacred Valley. Because of you and your feet and your lungs and your silence, you reach the next tambo. A small fire burns in a stone circle. A guard leans on a staff, watching lazily. The next Chasqui steps forward, hands ready. You pass the pouch. He doesn't. Speed. He turns. And just like that, the message is moving again. You sip warm maize beer, stretch your legs and sit on the ledge of the tambo, staring out across a valley of clouds. This is not a life of fame. No statues will be built of you, but the Sapa Inca depends on you. The whole system depends on you. And so, you run, but who built this vast network? Who planned its routes, chose its stations, trained its runners, and why? Was it just about taxes, or something more? The lost postal routes of the Inca Empire Section 2. The architect of the Andes Tachasky catches his breath in the cool shadow of a tambo. Far below, terraced fields cling to the mountainside like etchings in green stone. In the distance, somewhere behind the mist, lies Cusco, the center of the empire, the navel of the world. But before we talk about the messages, let's talk about the roads. Because the Capac owned this vast system of imperial roads didn't appear overnight. It was planned, designed, layered over centuries, and it represents one of the great logistical achievements of human civilization. When the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, they were stunned. These weren't dusty footpaths. These were paved highways, stone-cut drainage lined, often flanked by carved retaining walls. They scaled mountains, crossed deserts, spanned rivers on swinging rope bridges, and even tunneled through rock. But who had the foresight to build them? The answer is both simple and vast. The Inca inherited and expanded older road systems developed by previous Andean cultures. The Wallabies, the Tiwanaku, the Mocha. These civilizations had their own roads, but the Inca perfected the idea. Under emperors like Pachacati and his successors, the network was unified, standardized, and enforced. This wasn't just a trail, it was infrastructure engineered to keep an empire humming. Road inspectors known as Chocokuk were responsible. For maintenance, crews swept the routes, masons repaired broken stones. Tambos were stocked and restocked with food, water, and supply, sometimes by villagers conscripted for service under the Mita system, a rotating labor tax. Even rope bridges were rebuilt every year, using woven grass from nearby communities. Everything was regulated, and everything was documented, even if not on paper. The Quipacomo keepers of the Quipu were specialists in the Inca's unique form of record-keeping. Their job was to record tribute, census data, inventories, military orders, and tax collections through a system of knotted strings. Each color, knot type, and spacing had specific meaning. You can think of it as a three-dimensional spreadsheet, readable only by trained minds. Most people couldn't interpret them, but a Quipacomoc could read a Quipu as easily as you might read a grocery list. And for messages sent along the Chasqui routes, a small Quipu might carry a summary of harvest yields, a request for more laborers, or a military alert. But here's where it gets more impressive. Some messages were entirely oral. The Chasqui system also relied on memorized phrases, short, standardized verbal formulas passed between runners. They weren't just fast, they were specific. The message might go something like, by order of the Sapa Inca, 10 camelids from the southern herds are to be moved to the central pasture at Cochabamba before the second moon. No paper, no ink, just breath and memory, to prevent errors. Some tambos had memory referees, elders who would quiz the runners and verify the message before it passed forward. This was more than just communication, it was integration. The Inca Empire spanned over 2,500 miles and included more than 10 million people, dozens of languages, and countless ecological zones from the arid coast to the frozen peaks to the dense rainforest fringe. The roads, runners, and quipus brought it all together. You might be wondering, what were these messages really about? Were they mostly about taxes, warfare, or tribute? Yes, but not only. Some messages delivered imperial news, a royal birth, the death of a noble, the dates for a festival. Others summoned Caracas local chiefs to attend council meetings, or to host a traveling dignitary. Some were inventory updates, how much dried fish was left at the northern storage warehouse, how many pairs of sandals had been distributed to a conscripted army unit, and some were orders so mundane they'd never survive in a history book. Send additional porters to the construction site near Lake Titicaca, confirmed the arrival of the cotton bales. 10 llamas died en route, advised new route for herders. It's easy to think of empires in terms of crowns and conquest, but in the Inca world, empire was measured by how quickly a message could reach the next valley and how accurately it arrived. And here's the quiet genius of it. There was no writing, no wheeled carts, no horses, no postal codes, just stone roads, knotted cords, human lungs. And yet, a Chasqui standing on a windswept ridge in Cajamarca could set in motion an order that reached a military outpost in the Atacama Desert in less than a week. But now, the world is beginning to change. Whispers float in from the coast, of bearded men in metal armor, of animals with hooves, too fast to chase, of languages spoken in shouts. What happens to a message when the runners fall silent? What becomes of the roads when no one remembers where they lead? Silence on the stone roads. The sun is dropping toward the western Cordillera, staining the snow caps with liquid gold. Far below, a runner takes his position on a granite causeway, legs coiled like taut rope. He is waiting for the familiar flicker of a red-sashed silhouette, proof that the next message is on its way. But this evening no figure appears. Only wind moves across the puna grass. Llamas raise their heads, puzzled, then resume grazing. Somewhere much farther north, and the runner imagines Spanish cannon thunder along the walls of Cajamarca, and an empire begins to crack. You are still with the chasqui, feeling the queer hush that settles when a clock stops ticking. For generations, the Inca communication chain has been so precise that tambos regulated their food stores by the minute. A runner late is usually a runner injured, and protocol says the nearest attendant must sprint out to search. Yet tonight, the attendants also wait, straining ears for the patter of sandals that never comes. The day the knots went on Redwood of Atahualpa's capture travels faster than rumor has any right to move through mountains. And still, it is too slow. Shock freezes officials in Cusco. A Sapa Inca in shackles is not a scenario allowed for in administrative training. Some Quipacamotia are ordered to record the event. But how does one tie a knot for disbelief? They improvise new color codes, new loop formations, but doubt creeps under their fingernails. If the son of Inti, the sun, can be held for ransom by foreigners, what else in the firmament can shift? The response from the Great Council is confusion disguised as resolve. Dispatch runners to muster troops, redistribute maize from western storehouses, and send gold, so much gold to Cajamarca. Messages pour onto the Capac-own like rivers in flood season. But the chain has already begun to break. Spaniards seize tambos for lodging. Horses churn stone paths into dust. Slings and arrows once sufficed to guard the relay. But against steel and gunpowder, the chasqui fade like ink in rain. You picture a lone runner approaching a commandeered tambo. Spanish soldiers, wary from altitude, watch him with wary fascination. He tries to pass along his quipu. They mistake it for jewelry or witchcraft. Maybe they confiscate it. Maybe they toss it aside. Either way, the thread of communication unspools in the dust. It's not suddenly meaningless. When the roads went quiet within months, silent stretches appear along the highway, first a mile, then 20, then whole provinces. Runners hide or are conscripted as porters for conquistador expeditions. Tambos are raided for food. Rope bridges, those living woven arteries, are cut to prevent rebel crossings or burned in punitive raids. A system that once rivaled any old world post-collapses, not with an explosion but with scattered gaps, like beads slipping from a broken cord. Yet the roads remain. That is the paradox. Stones mortared into mountainsides do not surrender ice. Even Spanish chroniclers, dazzled and confused, admit grudging respect. These Indians have pathways like the Romans' causeways, though perched where no mule can walk to abreast. A few conquistadors recruit surviving chasqui to ferry. Letters stamped with European seals. The men oblige, but the cadence is off. Where once each leg was a sprint, now a single runner is forced to cover dozens of miles, dodging patrols and rival factions. He cannot keep the empire's heartbeat alive on his own. In Cusco, the naval center turned uneasy capital nobles debate resistance. Some urge rebellion, others accommodation. All know the highway is their only hope of coordinated action, but each fresh message faces capture. Spaniards learn to intercept quipu couriers much as rival kingdoms once intercepted Silk Road caravans. The coded language is still opaque to them, yet they trust torture to extract an oral translation. Trust, too, the terror that piles up whenever an Inca official is promised steel in place of maize. By 1535, the final royal orders calling for empire-wide mobilization drift through ghostly tambos unanswered. A runner might still sprint a pass at dawn, but he hands his quipu to no one. He waits, breathing thin air, listening until doubt overcomes duty. One last glance at the empty trail. Then he tucks the cords beneath a stone slab and slips away into cloud forest. Another fiber, severed. The knots we can't untie, trees turn. Spanish roads overlay Inca stone or divert around it for mule convenience. Colonial governors issue edicts forbidding heathen tally ropes. Some Quipacomac are executed. Others hide their craft, passing it in whispers to children who recite colors like contraband prayers, eventually even memory phrase. By the time Republican Peru declares independence in the 1800s, only fragments of the old code survive in remote valleys. Hints, not fluency. Modern archaeologists will unearth thousands of quipus, each one a small, deliberate storm of meaning. Loops for census, pendant threads for harvest, subsidiary knots for decimals. Deciphering them proves as elusive as cracking any cipher without a key. Researchers identify population tallies and llama counts, but narrative messages, the intangibles of order, emergency, love, remain locked behind twists of spun camelid fiber. We can measure their beauty, their complexity, but we struggle to hear their voice. A network without its language is half a ghost. Echoes underfoot, yet the roads endure. Hikers in the 21st century trace sections of the Capagon that still cling to ridges, stones polished by 600 years of rain. Farmers lead pack mules along switchbacks that Inca engineers plotted with geometric precision. In Tuor, a small Quechua village, elders rebuild a grass suspension bridge every June, braiding thousands of strands in a communal dance that recalls both engineering and ritual. When the final rope is hoisted, the people cheer not for tourists or cameras, but for continuity, for the feel of ancestors tugging at their palms. Stand on one of those bridges, planks bouncing beneath your feet, and look into the gorge wind. Sings where a runner's shout once echoed, catch the chord. Close your eyes, and perhaps you hear it still, a faint patter of sandals on stone, a puff of breath at 13,000 feet, a pouch of knots striking a ribcage with every stride. Communication never truly dies, it molts. The Inca pathways now carry buses, backpackers, satellite phones, but beneath each footfall lies an older rhythm, reminding us that information has always craved velocity and that human bodies, guided by trust and muscle memory, once outperformed any engine in the world. What remains after silence, so what? This survived of the Inca postal miracle. Fragments, a few preserved tambos, lengths of immaculate paving, quipus pieced together in museum drawers, but also ideas about redundancy, about communal labor, about calibrating infrastructure to the land rather than forcing the land to bend. Engineers today study Inca drainage channels. Logistics experts marvel at the relay's efficiency per calorie. And, quietly, linguists and mathematicians collaborate with Quechua communities to reanimate the Quipu code. Each newly deciphered knot is a syllable returned to the empire's long-muted conversation. Each schoolchild who participates in bridge weaving learns not from textbooks, but from fingertips how knowledge travels down generations without a single written word. Maybe that is the empire's final message, a warning about fragility, and a prayer for transmission. Systems, whether road, relay, or fiber optic cable, live or die by the people who maintain them. When trust snaps, when fear interrupts, the fastest highway turns to skeleton. Yet buried under dust, hope persists in stone foundations and braided grass, waiting for someone to feel the old vibrations and begin tying knots again. A question for the night as you drift toward sleep. Imagine the faint glow of cooking fires along a ridge, tambos lit like constellations on the dark spine of the Andes. Picture runners passing silhouettes against the Milky Way, messages twirling in their pouches. Then imagine the fires winking out, one by one, until only moonlight grazes abandoned paving stones. Ask yourself, if our own networks fell silent tonight, if screens went dark and satellites blinked out, what cords would we weave? What roads would we mend to stitch our voices back together? Somewhere, the echo of sandals on stone waits for your answer. What a Roman public bathroom was really like. All roads lead to the latrina. Year is 112 CE. You are in the city of Ostia, the bustling port of Rome, where ships creak in the harbor, an amphory of oil and wine stacked like cordwood. The air is tangy with salt, olive oil, and the occasional scent of drying fish. But for now, you've left the wharfs behind. You're heading to the Forca, that is, the public latrine. And no, you're not alone, because in ancient Rome, relieving oneself was not a private affair. It was civic, communal, designed for both sanitation and socialization. You turn down a shaded colonnade and enter the Thermae, a complex that houses baths, fountains, exercise yards, and, just beyond the changing rooms, you step inside. The room is surprisingly elegant. Polished marble benches line the walls, each punctuated by keyhole-shaped cutouts. Beneath them, a smooth trough of flowing water gurgles gently, carrying waste away to a sewer below. A second channel running just in front of the seating area contains cleaner water, this one for your cleaning sponge. Yes, sponge on a stick. The tessorium, as it was called, was ancient Rome's answer to toilet paper. After doing your business, you'd dip the sponge into the running water, give it a good rinse, and use it to tidy yourself. Then you'd rinse again, hopefully well, and return it to the communal bucket. You sit. On the bench beside you is a baker's apprentice. To your left, a retired soldier. A few seats down, a merchant holds a ledger on his lap, reviewing grain tallies while attending to nature. The conversation is casual, a bit of gossip about rising wine prices, a joke about someone slipping in the caldarium. No one looks embarrassed. Why would they in Roman life? The line between public and private was porous. Homes opened onto streets. Bedrooms doubled as dining rooms. Business happened in bathhouses. Deals were struck in taverns. And bodily functions were just another part of the daily routine. The Forca was not just a utility, it was a fixture of urban planning. Cities, large and small, had them, sometimes dozens. In wealthy districts they were marble-clad and frescoed. In poorer areas they might be tucked behind a tub and are open to the elements, but the design was always clever. Roman engineers understood sanitation. Their sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was a marvel still functioning in parts of Rome today. Public toilets connected to this main artery via gravity-fed drains. Water, usually from aqueducts, flushed waste continuously, in theory at least. Sometimes the flow stalled, sometimes the stench crept back, sometimes rats surfaced unexpectedly, but in general, Roman latrines were cleaner, more efficient, and more numerous than anything Europe would see again for over 1,000 years. Now, as you sit and listen to the water burble beneath your feet, you notice the art. A mosaic stretches along the floor, dolphins perhaps, or a scene of Neptune wielding his trident. Wall frescoes show nymphs in repose or satyrs dancing. It's not exactly calming, but it distracts. You glance down at the inscription carved into the bench edge, Cave Kanambeware the dog. It's probably a joke, or maybe not. There's graffiti too. Someone has scratched a proverb into the plaster. Fortuna fave fortibus. Fortune favors the bold. Another has drawn a rather rude caricature of a local magistrate. It's crude, but well executed. You snort quietly. That is the real Rome, not the Senate, not the gladiators, not the marble busts, but this room, where politics, digestion, and public hygiene intersect. You finish your business and rinse the tesorium. You stand, adjust your tunic, and nod to the baker's apprentice, who is in the middle of explaining why yesterday's rolls were burned. Something about ash and the fuel. On your way out, you pass a cistern, its lip worn smooth from years of hands dipping water. A boy refills the sponge bucket. An older man sharpens a reed stylus while humming a tavern tune. No one is in a hurry, and no one, not a single person, thinks it strange that the latrine is where half the city's news is. Exchanged still, you wonder, was there ever a time before all this civility when Romans went behind bushes, or did their business in buckets? Who decided that sanitation should become statecrafted? How did it reshape the empire's cities and habits? Latrines, laws, and the business of cleanliness are now several blocks from the baths, wandering through a Roman Vicasa neighborhood alive with carts, goats, perfumed matrons, and children with figs stuck to their fingers. Beneath the stone paving runs a secret world, pipes, drains, aqueduct channels, and the great arteries of Rome's sewer system. You, the average Roman citizen, may never descend into these tunnels, but you benefit from them daily. Still thinking about your recent visit to the Foraker, you begin to notice just how closely bathrooms are tied to everything else in the empire. Their construction wasn't an accident, nor was it a matter of luxury. It was policy. And in typical Roman fashion, policy came with paperwork. The latrine as civic institution by the height of the empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Public toilets weren't just tolerated, they were funded, overseen by magistrates. Known as aediles, these humble spaces became one of the many ways emperors proved their legitimacy. A new public toilet, ideally situated near a market or temple, was a visible symbol of the state's commitment to order, cleanliness, and public welfare. Records show that Emperor Vespasian in particular took a pragmatic interest in waste management. It was he who famously imposed a urine tax, spectacle urinae, on the collection of human waste from public latrines. Yes, you heard that right. The Romans taxed pee, but not just for the sake of revenue. Urine in ancient Rome was valuable. It was used in tanning leather, cleaning clothes, and even as a component in certain dyes. Fullers who operated early laundromats relied on the ammonia in urine to remove stains from togas. Containers placed outside foricas collected the liquid, which was then sold, bucket by bucket, to launders and tanners. When Vespasian's son Titus complained that such a tax was unseemly, the emperor held up a coin and reportedly said, "Nan, olet, it doesn't stink." You begin to realize this was a system. Waste was not just managed, it was monetized. Infrastructure wasn't only about convenience, it was about imperial identity, designs. Worth copying. The Romans didn't invent toilets, but they may have perfected them, at least by the standards of their time. Their public latrines were often built near bathhouses or taverns, where water was already abundant. Latrines were almost always co-located with a water source for flushing, cleaning, and supplying the ever-reused sponge. Architectural features often included bench seating, sometimes carved from marble, sometimes from wood, with up to 20 to 30 holes arranged in a U-shape for community use. Constant water flow. A cleverly sloped system ensured that waste traveled swiftly into the cloaca, the city's underground drainage channel. Secondary water channel located in front of the bench. This stream kept the sponge system functional and reduced bacterial growth. It also acted as a kind of Roman bidet, open air or semi-covered ceilings, to provide ventilation and to prevent an accidental methane accumulation. Incident 1 imagines the largest latrines, like the one in Ostia or the latrine of the baths of Caracalla, could accommodate dozens of people at once. Some even included mosaic floor art or small sculptures, and despite the smell, Romans clearly didn't see these spaces as degrading. Cicero himself once joked about arguing policy over the seat, and Seneca referred to certain bathroom conversations as more productive than meetings at the Senate. Hygiene or hopeful thinking. Modern assumptions might lead us to believe Roman latrines were cleaner than medieval alternatives, and in some ways they were. Running water, tiled floors, and airflow gave them an edge, but Roman hygiene wasn't perfect. Sponges by nature could spread parasites. Latrine seats were rarely cleaned between uses. Mosquitoes and rodents were common. Even the water, while constantly flowing, could stagnate in dry months or flood during storms. And then there was the risk of latrina ignis, the terrifying phenomenon of spontaneous methane combustion in sealed toilets. Pliny the Elder recounts stories of people injured by sudden fire in the darkness of the privy. It wasn't common, but it was enough to inspire protective rituals. Romans sometimes placed amulets, small figurines, or carvings of fortuna near latrine entrances. Others invoked spirits like Stercilicius, the god of fertilizer and manure asking for smooth digestion and safe passage, metaphorically and otherwise. Latrines weren't just practical spaces. They were liminal between clean and dirty, public and private, sacred and mundane. Laws and latrines back outside the Foraker. You might notice a magistrate's inscription above the door, built at the order of Aulus Cornelius Aedile during the consulship of Trajan. Latrines were political gifts. Their construction could win favor with the plebs. Their upkeep signaled a district's prestige. Let one fall into disrepair, and the locals might gossip. Let a rival build a larger, cleaner one, and your name might not survive the next election. Some toilets even had posted hours or guidelines carved in Latin. Naturally, do not linger. Respect the sponge, no betting at the bench, you smile at that last one. Apparently, some Foraker had gambling problems. Dice games, side bets, and impromptu contests were not uncommon. In Rome, everything was social. A thought while sitting, you find yourself wondering, what did Romans dream about? Sitting there with their tunics hitched up and their feet resting on cool mosaic. Did they ponder their place in the cosmos? Did they silently judge their neighbor's footwear? Or did they, like you, simply enjoy the quiet gurgle of water beneath their heels? And more than that, how did these humble, tiled spaces disappear from Western cities for 1,000 years? When Rome fell, did we forget how to build, or simply forget that it mattered? Flushing into the future, fading into the past, centuries pass. The roads crack, the aqueducts are breached, roofs fall, and marble benches collapse into rubble. And so, the Roman Foraker, once a fixture in every corner of the empire, vanishes from daily life. Not in one dramatic moment, not with the clang of swords or the roar of barbarians, but slowly, quietly, like so many things do when empires change hands and priorities shift. The last sponge dries out. The last sponge dries out, and the sound of gently running water beneath the seat becomes a memory. The fall of the latrinas, the Western Roman Empire staggered into its final centuries. Its once proud infrastructure began to crumble. Aqueducts went untended, choked by silt or destroyed by invaders who mistook them for bridges. With no fresh water flowing, the latrines fell silent. Without maintenance crews, those teams of anonymous workers who swept, repaired, and the system broke down. And when the plumbing stopped, the habits changed. By the early Middle Ages, Europe had largely abandoned public sanitation. Waste was once again dumped into the streets, tossed from windows, or buried in shallow pits. For 1,000 years, urban defecation reverted to what the Romans would have considered primitive. It's not that the knowledge was entirely lost. Some monastic communities preserved rudimentary systems. The Byzantines retained their bathhouses longer than their Western cousins. But the elegant integration of sewer and society, of public hygiene as civic pride, had faded. Why? Partly because the Roman latrine was expensive. It required state funding, coordinated aqueducts, tax revenue, and political will. In the fragmented kingdoms of post-Roman Europe, these were in short supply. Even when latrines were rebuilt, they were often private, tucked behind castles or monasteries, not open to the fishmonger and the mosaic artist alike. Something else changed. Two attitudes toward privacy. Then Rome. The communal bathroom was just that, communal, but later societies grew more bashful. Exposure came to mean shame. Nature's call became something to hide, not to share. And so, the public toilet became taboo, the sponge became a legend, and the Roman latrine, with its carved seats and gossip-worthy acoustics, slipped into the footnotes of history. What the Romans left behind still, the evidence remained quietly buried beneath centuries of dust. In the ruins of Ostia, archaeologists uncovered complete latrine rooms, marble benches, drainage systems, mosaics of dolphins, still grinning beside faded graffiti. In Herculaneum and Pompeii, latrines survived the eruption of Vesuvius, entombed in ash, perfectly preserved down to the final, interrupted sponge. Some discoveries were even stranger. In York, England, once the Roman town of Eboracum, archaeologists found a preserved communal toilet trench, still containing samples of ancient human waste. Analysis revealed worm eggs and parasite traces, confirming that the sponge system, for all its ingenuity, was not without hygienic flaws. But there was also evidence of shared rituals, charcoal from incense burned nearby, perhaps to mask odor, or perhaps as part of a blessing. Roman toilets were liminal spaces between public and private, between clean and unclean, between the living and the gods. And maybe that's what makes them so compelling. They weren't just places to go, they were places to be. To talk, to rest, to read graffiti and ponder fate, to whisper gossip or recite yesterday's courtroom drama, to be human. In one latrine in Ephesus, a message scratched into the stone reads, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. A strange place to find a romantic sentiment, but maybe not. After all, what better space for vulnerability than a room where everyone is quite literally exposed? A reflection in the tile as you return in imagination to your seat on the cool marble bench. Sponge bucket at your side. Think of all the people who sat here before you. The senator debating grain tariffs, the priest mumbling prayers under his breath, the teenager rolling dice while waiting for the bath to open, the architect who noted how cleverly the runoff sluiced beneath the floor. thousands of anonymous lives, each one paused here, however briefly, sharing in the most universal of human acts. It's easy to joke about Roman toilets, but it's harder and perhaps more rewarding to recognize them as a kind of mirror. In the echoes of the Forca, we hear a whisper of civilization that once made space for dignity, cleanliness, and conversation, all in the same room. Out as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the water trickling past your feet. Imagine the soft hum of conversation, the clink of a coin, the rustle of linen. Picture a world where sanitation was not hidden but celebrated. Ask yourself, when did we decide that comfort should come at the cost of community? And what might we rediscover by sitting down together and simply listening to the plumbing? The secret lives of medieval bakers. Up before the roost of the year is 1327. The village still sleeps, but you're awake. You've been awake for hours, because you are a baker, and in the medieval world, that means your day begins in the dark. Long before even the watchman's torches dim, the air in your little shop is warm already, thanks to the great bread oven that radiates heat from the carved stone walls. The scent of flour, smoke, and faintly sour dough clings to your tunic. You're barefoot, your feet know every stone in the floor by heart. You've just shaped your second batch of loaves, each one dusted and nestled onto wooden boards, waiting for the oven to settle to the right temperature. There is no thermometer, no timer. You test the heat by reaching in and scattering flour on the oven's floor. If it turns golden brown in 3 heartbeats, it's ready. You're not a glamorous figure. No one writes songs about bakers. You wear simple linen, your arms are covered in a crust of dried dough, and your hair smells like smoke and yeast. But your role in this village or town, if you're lucky, is far more critical than it might appear, because without you, people don't eat, in any reliable sense. Medieval bread wasn't just a side dish. It was the cornerstone of survival. For the poor, it might be the only food they had all day. For the wealthy, it accompanied every meal, even if gilded with butter or dipped in spiced wine. But whether crusty, dark, soft, or sour, it came from people like you up before dawn, sweating beside a stone oven. Then make no mistake, it wasn't easy. Flour didn't arrive in neat paper sacks. You either milled your own, laboriously grinding grain in a stone quern, or purchased it from the local millifan for a high fee, and sometimes under strict supervision. In some towns, mills were operated by the lord of the manor using a hand. Mill without permission, technically illegal, could cost you a fine, or worse, your millstones confiscated. Still, most bakers paid the miller, picked up their sacks of flour, and returned to begin the careful dance of mixing, fermenting, kneading, shaping, and baking. Yeast was another story. In the early 14th century, commercial yeast did not exist. Most bakers relied on balm the foam skimmed off brewing beer or on a sourdough starter passed down like family silver. The starter had to be fed daily. If it died, you started over, or borrowed a scrap from a neighbor assuming they liked you. Water was added next, usually from a nearby well or clean stream. Hard water made dough tougher, soft water made it slack, but you made do. Salt was added. Last, sparingly it was taxed. After all, then came the kneading, long, repetitive, rhythmic, enough to turn a soft dough into a strong one, ready to hold its shape. You worked quickly. The village would begin waking soon as the oven reached its peak heat. You raked out the ashes with a wet cloth on a stick. The walls glowed faintly orange. No fire burned inside now. The residual heat would bake the loaves. You slid them in one by one using a long-handled peel, gauging where the hot spots were, and then you waited, not idly. There were customers to prepare for, benches to clean, more dough to shape. If you were fortunate enough to have an apprentice, he'd be sweeping, shaping, maybe falling asleep, standing up. You'd swat him with a rag and hand him a jug to fetch more water. The villagers would soon arrive, first the servants, sent by their households to collect the morning loaves. Then housewives, carrying coins or sometimes bartered goods, eggs, a chicken, herbs. A few wealthy merchants might come themselves, hoping for the softer white loaves baked from bolted flour pain de maille, as the French called it. But for most, it was rye or barley bread. Dense, heavy filling sometimes. The dough was baked on leaves fig or cabbage or in shared communal ovens run by the town. In those cases, your job was to shape your loaves in a way that set them apart. Some people marked them with a family sigil, a scratched X, or a braided twist. If you couldn't identify your bread, you might not get it back. And there were rules, so many rules. In most towns and cities, bakers were regulated by strict laws. Bread was too important to leave to chance. Too small a loaf, or one made with poor flour, could land you in serious trouble. A baker found cheating the scales, selling short weight, could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to give bread away free for a week. In some places, the penalty was theatrical. A dishonest baker might be tied to a cart and paraded through the village with loaves hung around his neck, or even dunked in the river. It wasn't just about honesty, it was about trust. Bread had to feed the people, and the people, in turn, had to trust that it would be there, every morning, warm and honest. You pull your loaves from the oven, they're golden, cracking gently, the smell rich with a tang of smoke and yeast, a good batch. You arrange them on a cooling rack. A few go to the Lord Steward, a few to regulars who pay on credit, and the rest will be gone by noon. You wipe your brow. The village bell begins to ring. And still, you have more to do. Another batch of dough bubbles quietly in the mixing trough. The sun is barely up, your arms ache. But the work isn't done, it never is. Still, as you lean against the warm oven and let the scent of bread fill your lungs, you wonder, who taught the first baker to coax a crust from grain and fire? And how did this humble, daily craft shape 1,000 years of hunger, ritual, and quiet resilience? Of guilds, grain, and the bread riots nobody talks about. That air in your bakehouse is heavier now midday, heat settling around the stones like a thick wool cloak. Loaves cool on racks. The second batch rises under linen. Outside, a donkey clatters, past with a cart of onions, and someone is singing badly from a nearby alley. Inside. You're doing math because today isn't just about flour and fire, it's about survival, about weights, measures, guild rules, taxation, and the careful calculation of what it costs to feed your community without going bankrupt. The price of a loaf in many medieval towns, bread had a fixed price. That meant your margin changed daily, depending on the cost of grain. And when harvests were poor or mills delayed, your costs climbed but your price couldn't. The law said so. It was all part of what scholars call the assize of bread, a legal mechanism that aimed to protect consumers from being gouged during hard times. Town councils published tables showing exactly how much a loaf should weigh based on the going price of flour. The higher the grain cost, the smaller your loaves had to be. The lower the cost, the larger, but the price stayed the same. It sounds fair, doesn't it? Except when the math didn't work. Flour might come late, or the mill might grind coarsely, ruining the dough, or the wood might burn unevenly, scorching the crust. And still, if your loaves came in underweight, the bread inspectors would show up. They were real. They carried scales, wooden molds, and occasionally long sticks for checking oven cleanliness. They were usually appointed by the town, and though not always corrupt, they weren't especially forgiving either. If caught shorting wet oven by accident, you could be fined, banned from baking for a month, or, in extreme cases, locked in the pillory with a sign around your neck reading "cheated his neighbors." And yet, despite the threat of punishment, some bakers cheated anyway because sometimes you had no choice. Bakers and the guild in larger towns and cities, baking was controlled by guilds, powerful trade organizations that protected standards, regulated apprenticeships, and negotiated with city officials. To bake legally, you had to be a member. To become a member, you had to train for years. First as an apprentice, sleeping on a flour sack in your master's shop, eating crusts, burning your fingers on hot peels, and memorizing every stage of fermentation by smell alone. Then, if you were lucky, you graduated to journeyman, moving from bakery to bakery across the region, gathering knowledge, recipes, and scars. Only then, after years of training and a test loaf baked before a panel of frowning elders, could you apply for master baker status and open your own shop. But guild membership wasn't just about baking, it was also about politics. Some guilds held parades, carried banners, even commissioned their own saints' altars. They lobbied for grain, price caps, demanded better roads for flour delivery, or paid to repair town ovens. In cities like Paris, London, and Florence, the Bakers' Guild could make or break a mayor's campaign. But not all bakers belonged to a guild in rural areas. Many baked illegally quietly for neighbors, bartering loaves for chickens or beer. These hedge bakers were vital during hard times, but if caught, they could be fined or exiled. Guild bakers hated them, officials distrusted them, but the poor depended on them. Bread riots and the politics of hunger. Now picture this. A cold spring, rain through the harvest, grain prices double. The local mill closes after a wheel collapse. Town bakers can't meet demand and people start to panic. Bread, you see, was not just food, it was a promise, a contract between ruler and ruled. If that contract was broken, if the shelves were empty or the loaves too small, people noticed, and when enough people noticed, riots began. In 1323. In the city of Montpellier, a crowd stormed the town bakery after days of high prices. The baker fled, his loaves were seized and redistributed. In 1378. Florence saw waves of food protests when bread became scarce. Bakers were accused of hoarding grain or mixing flour with chalk and sawdust. Some were dragged through the streets. Even London wasn't immune. One 14th century chronicler recorded that a dishonest baker had his loaves nailed to his head and was made to march through the marketplace. Whether this was literal or metaphorical is unclear. Either way, the message stuck. You, as a baker, walked a thin line between public service and scapegoat, and yet you baked. Every morning. You woke before the rooster started the fire, fed the sourdough, shaped the loaves, swept the floor, and watched the heat rise behind the stone arch of the oven. You baked because it mattered, because it fed the people, because it gave your name weight in the marketplace, and because you loved it. Even in the quiet hours, before the door creaked open and coins rang on the counter, you felt the rhythm of dough beneath your hands, the way it sighed as it rose, the slight stickiness of the crust before the first crackle. Bread, in its own way, was a language, the baker's blessing in some towns. Customers crossed themselves before taking the first bite. Others kissed the crust. Many believed a blessed loaf could protect against illness or evil dreams. Superstition, perhaps, but perhaps they knew what they were doing. Bread was a gift, a risk, a ritual, and as you lean on your flour-crusted table, eyeing the next batch with the practiced glance of someone who's made 10,000 loaves, you think not for the first time what happens when people stop trusting their daily bread. When the thing that was always there, quietly waiting on the table, vanishes. Does the world get louder, or just hungrier? Crumbs at the end of the day. The sun has fallen low. Its last golden beam hits the side of your bakehouse, casting long shadows on the cobbled street. The day's final customers have come and gone. Some cheerful, others cross, a few too tired to speak. Beggar asked for a heel of crust. You gave it. He blessed you with a toothless grin. Now it is quiet. The bread racks are nearly empty. A few round loaves cool beside the window. The room smells of heat and ash, a sour sponge, and faint sweetness like wheat dreaming in the dark. Your hands are stiff, knees sore, shoulders sag, but the silence is kind. You begin to clean. First the flour-dusted table, scraped with a smooth piece of wood. Then the bins, the trough, the old wooden peel, its edge blackened from years of sliding loaves into fire. The oven is still warm but no longer fierce. You toss in a handful of herbs, rosemary, maybe just for the scent. There's a rhythm to these final hours. A dignity in closing the shop that matches the ritual of opening it. You mark off sales on a wax tablet, count out coins, tuck a few into a pouch hidden behind a beam. Tomorrow you will do this all again, but tonight there is time to think. Bread is memory. You remember your apprenticeship, long mornings of silence, the way the master would test your dough by pressing one finger in the center and watching how it sighed back. You remember burning your thumb on your first solo batch, the day you earned your mark, the braided twist that made your loaves yours. You remember your mother's hands, rough with work, holding a slice of bread like it was treasure. Bread was never just food, it was time, shaped and fired. A record of the sun, the rain, the strength of the hands that milled the grain, and the mood of the yeast that morning. It was your proof of place, of usefulness, of identity. Each loaf carried a little of you into the world. The loaf that traveled now and then. Someone important came through town, an abbot, perhaps, or a minor nobleman ordered special bread. Soft white, maybe shaped like a rose or plated like rope. You made it with extra care. Polished the crust with egg yolk. Watched it vanish into a carriage top once. You baked a batch for a wedding, another time, for a funeral. And once, for reasons still unclear, a night ordered 50 loaves, all round and flat, to be used as trenchers at a feast. They came back the next morning, crusts soaked with meat juice, piled at your door. You fed them to the pigs. Even that was part of the cycle. Nothing wasted, everything used, the bread of the poorhan. Then there were the dark loaves, the maslin bread, made from mixed grains, rye, oats, barley, sometimes even beans when times were hard. Heavy, sour, a little bitter, but it filled the belly. You shaped it by feel. You could recognize your regulars by how they held it, one hand under, one hand cradling the top. Some paid in eggs, some paid in labor. One girl once paid with a song. You let her take 2 loaves. She came back every week, and when the harvest failed, and people came to your door without words, without coins, without hope, you gave what you could. A half loaf here, a crust there, enough, maybe, to keep someone warm until the soup boiled. Your wife said you'd go hungry for it. She wasn't wrong, but you slept better because you remembered the words from the church. Steps, give us this day our daily bread. And who were few to deny anyone that what remains, it's late now. The fire is banked. You pour a mug of ale and break a crust from the last loaf. It's still warm. You chew slowly, listening to the quiet crackle of settling coals. The village bell tolls the 9th hour. Someone coughs. 2 streets away, a cat knocks over a bucket in the alley. The wind shifts, bringing the smell of distant hay. You feel it. Then that strange sense of time folding in on itself. You have no portraits, no written record. Your name may not last another generation, but someone will remember your bread, the shape of the crust, the smell of rye, the feeling of a warm heel pressed into cold hands 1,000 years from now. When archaeologists sift through layers of ash and tile, they may find your oven. They may find burnt crumbs, maybe even the stone weight you used to measure flour. They will say, someone baked here, someone fed the village, and that will be enough because bread leaves no monuments, only memories, and even those fade, except in the shape of the hand that feeds. Why ancient Egyptian barbers also worked in temples, razors, rituals, and the sacred haircut. The sun rises early, in Thebes. Even before it crests the palm-dotted horizon, the sandstone of the temple begins to glow. The city stirs a blend of bleating goats, the distant slap of sandals on dust, and the soft hum of priests already beginning their morning rites. But your day, as a barber, started long before dawn. You're not a priest. You don't wear the panther skin sash of the high clergy or carry scrolls of sacred hymns. But you have your own tools of power. A small oiled razor made of bronze, a comb carved from bone, a jar of scented oil, perhaps myrrh or lotus, And, above all, a steady hand. Because in ancient Egypt, cutting hair wasn't just grooming, it was sacred. Barbers were more than street tradesmen. They were part ritualist, part healer, part confidant, and in some temples, especially those of Amen, Ra, or Hathor, they were initiated, trained, trusted. Why? Because in ancient Egyptian belief, cleanliness was close to godliness, and no ritual, no offering, no sacred performance could take place until the body was pure shaved, washed, and anointed. And that was your domain, the shaved world of the divine. Take a moment to picture yourself there. You walk through the outer court of a temple, complex columns soaring like stone papyrus stalks, walls painted with scenes of gods weighing hearts, smiting chaos, or embracing the sun. You enter a small side chamber where a junior priest waits silently on a stool. He bows his head. You open your satchel. He must be shaved before sunrise, not just his chin, but his head, chest, and limbs. Every hair must be removed before he steps into the naos, the holy inner chamber. Even a single stray hair is an impurity, an affront to the god's presence. Your hands are precise, practiced. You've shaved hundreds of priests, maybe thousands. You know the contours of the skull like a cartographer knows maps. The razor glides smoothly over damp skin, guided by warm water and scented oil. You do not speak. Shaving is a quiet ritual. When you're done, he looks years younger. The skin is smooth, pale under the torchlight. He thanks you with a quiet nod. You bow in return, step back, and collect your tools. Someone else will come soon, a scribe, a dancer, perhaps even the high priest himself. Because everyone must be shaved before entering the god's presence. Barbers of the street, barbers of the temple. But your work isn't limited to temples. Out in the open markets of Memphis or Heliopolis, you might also have a small butha stool, a mirror of polished copper, and your trusted kit. Clients from all walks of life stop by, farmers before festivals, scribes before job interviews, young boys getting their first adult style, often a full shave, leaving just a side lock of youth. Hair, in Egypt, was more than fashion, it was identity. Children often wore one long braid, while young, cut ceremonially at puberty. Nobles might wear shaved scalps covered by elaborate wigs. Priests, as you know well, shaved everything head to toe. And mourners, they often let their hair grow during periods of grief, a visible sign of disruption and sorrow. You, as a barber, understood these symbols. You shaved them, literally. But not just with razors. Some clients wanted styling braids, oils, ornamental clips made of gold or faience. Others wanted cleansing, a scalp scrub, an application of kohl to the eyes. And still others simply needed someone to listen. In a time without therapists, the barber's chair was where men and occasionally women spoke freely about their families, their business, their fears. Barbers were often trusted, respected, sometimes even feared, because, after all, you held the razor. Tools of the trade. Your barber's kit, kept in a linen satchel or clay box, contains bronze razors, often semicircular, honed to a fine edge, cleaned in oil and sand. Combs, dual-sided, some fine-toothed for lice, others for styling, ointments, animal fat, perfumed oils, and sometimes beeswax, tweezers, for detailed work, eyebrows, or that one stubborn chin hair on a nobleman. Mirror, polished disc of copper or bronze, warm to the touch and slightly distorted. All of it was personal. Tools were rarely shared between barbers. You sharpened them yourself, passed them down. Some had the names of owners etched in hieroglyphs. Others bore small charm spreads to Ptah for steady hands, or to Base, the dwarf god who protected against accidents and evil spirits. Because accidents did happen. A slip of the blade, a bad reaction to oil, a rash blamed on an angry ghost. Superstition ran high, and you had to walk carefully between medicine and magic, craft and curse. Yet through it all, you worked, day after day, dawn to dusk, razor in hand, listening to stories, watching people change under your fingers, boys into men, mourners into celebrants, ordinary citizens into ritual pure devotees of the gods. You shaved the heads of acolytes before they joined the priesthood. You cut the last braid from a young girl before her wedding. You soothed the nerves of a trembling man on the eve of a judgment before the temple tribunal. And every time your razor sang its soft, scraping song across skin, you wondered, why is it that hair, so fragile and fleeting, holds so much power? In a world of stone monuments and eternal gods, between the blade and the gods, you are standing at the edge of the sacred lake. It's quiet here. The reeds sway gently, and lotus flowers bloom across the still surface. Behind you, the temple looms massive, solemn, echoing with prayers and footsteps. You kneel. You're not just washing your hands, you're purifying them. Because the man you're about to shave is no ordinary client. He's a priest of Amen. Tomorrow, he will perform one of the highest rituals of the temple calendar. Tonight, you will ready him not with chants, but with razors. The cleansing has begun. Purity as policy in the world of ancient Egypt. The principle of cosmic balance was everything. The Nile must rise, the pharaoh must rule justly, and the temples must be clean. not just physically, but spiritually. Hair was considered unclean, not in a judgmental way, but in a ritual one. Hair could collect dust, lice, oils. It marked the passage of time, of grief, of decay. In the eternal stasis of the divine, hair was too mortal, too human. So it had to go. Before any priest could enter the naos, the god's most sacred space, he had to be ritually pure. That meant bathing often multiple times a day. That meant linen washed in river water. That meant diet, celibacy, silence, and that meant being shaved from head to toe. And for that they came to you. You, the temple's barber, held no priestly rank, but you held the razor. You knew the secret paths of the scalp, the sweep of the cheek, the angle of the shoulder blade. You were trained to be thorough, but gentle, fast, but respectful. In this sacred context, shaving was not just grooming, it was ritual removal of impurity, a cleansing of the self before approaching eternity. Temple hierarchies in the temple was a city within a city. Inside its walls, dozens, sometimes hundreds of workers lived and served. Priests, scribes, dancers, cooks, guards, brewers, embalmers, and yes, barbers. Some temples had entire departments devoted to barbers weren't just shaving priests. They were responsible for trimming ceremonial wigs worn by high-ranking temple staff during festivals, maintaining the appearance of divine statues. Some god images had hairpieces that had to be brushed, oiled, or ritually combed. Preparing initiates, before a young novice could begin training, they underwent full purification, including tonsure, by temple barber. Barbers even had access to private temple quarters unheard of for most workers. You might find yourself alone with the high priest of Osiris, your blade gliding along his scalp as he recited prayers under his breath. No one else could be present. Barbers kept secrets. Barbers heard confessions. Barbers were trusted, and they were discreet. Wigs, wealth, and what was hidden but not everyone shaved, outside the temple. In the dusty streets of Saqqara or the busy markets of Memphis, hair was fashion. It was identity. It was a billboard of class, age, and sometimes defiance. You styled wigs for noble women, intricate, curled, oiled with cedar and held in place by beeswax. Some preferred ringlets. Others wanted elaborate crowns of braids. The wealthiest wore wigs adorned with gold beads or lapis lazuli ornaments. You fitted these wigs carefully over shaved scalps. A fashionable look, but also practical in Egypt's relentless heat. Wigs were often stored on stands in private homes, combed and perfumed like pets. One noblewoman even had hers buried with her. Children had simpler styles. The side lock of Horus, single braid left hanging over one earmark. A child under divine protection, you'd be summoned to cut it ceremonially when they came of age, but not all hair was welcome. You also removed body hair, armpits, arms, legs, even eyebrows in some cases. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was considered civilized, clean, Egyptian. Foreigners, like the Libyans or the Hyksos, were sometimes portrayed in tomb art with long beards and shaggy hair. Hairiness became a kind of shorthand for otherness. Egyptian elites, by contrast, were smooth, symmetrical, eternal. And you helped them become that. You shaped the image they wished to project to the world and to the gods. When the blade faltered, but sometimes things went wrong. A nick too deep, a rash from oil, a blade that dulled mid-stroke. In such moments, your work could be questioned. Superstition ran thick in temple air. If a ritual went poorly, if the harvest failed, if a priest stumbled on the steps, someone might whisper that the barber's hand was unsteady, that the purification was incomplete, that a single forgotten hair had offended the gods. Most of the time, it passed, but there were stories that one tells of a barber in Karnak who was banished after leaving a nick on a priest's ear before the feast. Of Opet, the gods, they said, had turned their face from the temple. The Nile failed to flood. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where hair was holiness, the blade had consequences. You, of course, have been lucky. Your hands are steady, your blades are sharp. And when the priests step into the inner sanctum, they do so shaved clean, oiled and shining. To speak with God. Still, you sometimes wonder what it meant to shave away every sign of life, to erase the evidence of age and body. Was it reverence or fear? And what was lost in the name of appearing pure before stone-eyed gods? The final shave and the afterlife's mirror. It is the 7th day of the lunar month tonight. The moon will rise full and pale over the limestone walls of the necropolis. You've been summoned not to the temple this time, but to a small house of mourning. The air is thick with incense and quiet weeping. The body lies in the next room, wrapped in fine linen, the outline of the nose and cheeks still faintly visible. You are here to perform your most sacred task. You are here to shave the dead, preparing for eternity. In ancient Egyptian belief, death was not an end, but a journey, a transformation, and that journey required preparation, rituals, offerings, incantations, and yes, appearance. Just as a priest must be cleansed before approaching the gods in life, so must the deceased be purified before meeting Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths. The barber kneeled beside the linen-wrapped form. Carefully, respectfully, you unwrap just enough to expose the face. You dampen a cloth with myrrh-scented water. You open your small bronze razor and begin. Every movement is deliberate. You speak, no words. You don't need to dot. This is the final shave. It's done not for vanity but for order. Mat, the principle of balance and correctness. In the afterlife, the dead will be judged hard, weighed against a feather, soul questioned by gods. And, while true judgment lies in one's deeds, appearance matters. Cleanliness is harmony. A smooth face is readiness. You shave the chin, the scalp, the neck. You rewrap the linen. You anoint the body with oil, then you leave, and you leave the blade. Behind it is now part of the tomb's contents. A tool once used for life, now buried with the person whose body it prepared. And somewhere, you believe they will awaken in a realm of reeds and light, clean-shaven, perfumed whole. Your work goes with them. Barbers in tomb paintings and texts. You return home and sit in your courtyard, the stars beginning to appear. You recall the tomb paintings you've seen, noblemen reclining with cups of wine, their wives behind them, attendants in long linen robes and barbers. There in the background, tools in hand. You don't wear gold, you don't lead prayers, but your work was honored. On some tomb walls, barbers are depicted shaving a priest before ritual. In others they are shown as part of funerary scenes, applying oils or placing a final comb in the hair of a mummy before burial. In texts too, you find mention. One funerary spell says, "Let the face be shaved, the limbs purified, the body made whole, that the soul may see the gods with a clean mouth and a smooth brow." It is not flowery, but it is powerful. You remember a boy once asked you, "Gods had barbers," you told him, "Perhaps not, but everyone who speaks to a god must look the part." Barber as timekeeper, and so you continue day after day, shave after shave. The seasons pass. The Nile rises and falls. Temples bustle, then fall silent. Priests grow old and are replaced. But the need for you endures, because hair grows, because dust clings, because ritual never truly ends. You are not a scribe, but your blades leave a different record, one written on the skin. Fleeting, yes, erased each week, but meaningful. Sometimes you wonder if anyone will remember your name. It's not carved in the temple walls. You don't own land or commission statues, but maybe, just maybe, a line of hieroglyphs etched in a tomb no one has opened in 3,000 years still says, "He who shaved the high priest before the feast of the new moon, steady of hand, pure of heart." And maybe that is enough. Because in the act of removing, you left something behind. Because in making others ready to face the divine, you became quietly, humbly a part of the divine order yourself. And as you close your eyes, that night, the breeze rustling through your open window like temple incense on a festival day, you ask, in a world where so much was built to last, was it the soft hand with the blade, the one who vanished after the final stroke, that kept the sacred truly alive? How the first clocks confused 14th century villagers before the ticking began, before there were clocks. There was the sun. It crested slowly over the hills, spilled down village roofs, and eventually struck the belfry of the church. That was the signal. Time to rise. Not 7 a.m., but simply morning. The light told you. The roosters confirmed it. Time then was a matter of when, not what time. You worked when it was light. You ate when you were hungry. You slept when the candles burned out. There were bells. Yes, rung by monks or parish priests, but they marked moments, not measured them. Prime, terce, sext, none. These were prayer hours, loosely arranged, tied to the position of the sun and the customs of the cloister. But then came something different. Something loud, something mechanical. It started in the city's first large ones like Milan, Paris, and Salisbury. It usually began with a sounder bell, louder than any hand-rung chime, one that rang on its own. Not when the priest pulled a rope, not when a boy ran across the square, but exactly when the machine said it should. The first mechanical clocks had arrived, and villagers, bless them, had no idea what to make of it. The arrival of the timekeeper. Picture a town in the late 1300s. Maybe it's in England, maybe in Flanders, maybe somewhere tucked between the Alps and the Rhine. One day, scaffolding appears on the church tower. Carpenters clatter. A blacksmith delivers strange heavy parts, wheels with teeth, rods of iron, enormous lead weights. Rumors fly. Some say it's an astronomical device. Others claim it's a magical chime to scare away storms. After weeks, maybe months, it is revealed. A great iron bell, a clanging arm, and somewhere, hidden behind wooden panels, a tangle of gears, pulleys, and stone weights descending slowly with each passing minute. The first mechanical clock, no face, no hands, just sound. It rings at intervals, maybe every hour, maybe every quarter, and it rings whether the sun shines or not, whether the priest is awake or not. People gather beneath it and stare. Some are awed, others are suspicious. One old farmer murmurs that it sounds like a forge hammer in the sky. A miller swears his donkey won't sleep near it. A child asks if there's a tiny man trapped inside. The priest, for his part, approves. Mostly, the clock makes his life easier. No more rushing to ring the bell for none or vespers. The clock does it predictably, faithfully, inarguably, and that's where the trouble begins. Because villagers are not used to arguing with bells, a new kind of authority before clocks. Time had belonged to people, to priests, 2 mothers, 2 sun and season. Days were long or short, busy or slow, depending on the work. The harvest, the weather now. Time belongs to the mechanism. The bell rings for prayer, even if the priest isn't ready. The bell rings for closing the market, even if the sun still shines. The bell rings for curfew, and the night watchman points to it and says, "Go home." The clock has spoken. At first, this feels novel. Then, slightly irritating. Eventually, unsettling, because what if the clock is wrong? What if it runs fast or slow? What if the weights slip or the gears stick? What if, heaven forbid, it strikes 13? Who will correct it? And how will you know it's been corrected? These were real questions, debated in town councils and alehouses. Some people refused to change their habits. They said, "I'll milk my goats when the sky turns red, not when some iron owl barks at me." Others were more curious. Merchants began timing their deals. Priests adjusted sermons to the chimes. Bakers tried to time their dough between the hour strikes. It worked. Sometimes. Other times, they ended up with bread that was half done or burnt, and blamed the gears. From bells to gears to lives over time, the clock gained a kind of respect. It never forgot. It never drank too much wine and missed a bell pull. It did not get sick. It did not sleep. Its weights dropped slowly like the sand in an hourglass, but with a regularity no human could match. Still, few understood it. If you were a curious villager, you might ask to see the inside. Sometimes a friendly warden or church clerk would oblige. You'd be taken up the dark spiral stair of the tower, up and up, past the ringing chamber, into a narrow loft filled with creaks and clicks. There, in a wooden case or open on a platform, you'd see it, a wheel turning, teeth catching, a rod shifting, a lever rising slowly. Then clang the bell sounds and the mechanism resets. You'd blink, you'd nod, you'd pretend to understand, but walking back down, the thought lingers. If the clock controls time, and time controls us, who controls the clock? When ours got sharp edges, it's been 6 months since the clock was installed. By now, the town has adjusted mostly. The bell rings regularly. The priest has stopped arriving late to prime. The market stalls pack up promptly when the hour chimes. The town watch patrols by strike count. Even the tavern starts wiping down tables at the 8th bell, though no one likes it. But the deeper change isn't in when things happen. It's in how people think about time. Time used to be something you moved through. Now it feels like something moving past you. And it moves at the same pace, whether you're busy or idle, tired or alert. The gears don't care, they just turn. Some villagers love it. A young merchant boasts that he times his deliveries. A local brewer begins measuring fermentation by the hour instead of the day. Even the blacksmith starts charging by the strike, 2 hours work replacing a morning's job. But for others, something feels off. You hear it in quiet complaints. "I used to feel the time in my bones," says one farmer. "Now I just hear it from above." And he's not wrong, because something has changed, not just in behavior, but in the rhythms of life itself. The invention of the hour to us. An hour feels natural, familiar, an even slice of the day. But in the 14th century, it was a new idea. Previously, the length of an hour could change with the season. There were 12 hours of daylight and 12 of night, meaning daytime hours in summer were longer than in winter. People tracked them loosely, with sundials, shadows, bells, and habit. Now the mechanical clock said firmly, all hours are equal. 60 minutes all year, day or night. It was a powerful, radical shift, especially for farmers, monks, and craftsmen who had once shaped their work around natural light and instinct. At first, many ignored it. They still rose with the sun, still paused for lunch when the bell in their stomach rang, still judged a day's work by the wear on their hands, not the number of chimes from the belfry. But gradually, the clock's logic began to win. Monasteries especially took to it. Benedictine monks had always organized their days around strict prayer schedules. But now, the mechanical clock gave them unprecedented precision. No more nudging the timekeeper awake at 3 a.m. The gears woke the monastery, and in towns, civic officials liked the order. It was easier to enforce curfews, market hours, work contracts, and even legal proceedings with a fixed hour count. You could no longer say, "The sun wasn't up yet." Now, they'd reply, "The bell had rung." Time had gained sharpness. It was no longer a fluid stream. It was measured, counted, divided, and some found that uncomfortable suspicion in the streets. There were whispers that the clock was unnatural, that it offended God by boxing time. One priest cautioned from the pulpit that only the divine should command the hours, not gears and bells. Others worried that it signaled something darker, a tool for merchants to squeeze more work from laborers, for town officials to tighten control. Time, once shared, now belonged to those who could afford to measure it. A carpenter's apprentice complained, "The hour bell rings faster when you're not paid by it." One woman swore her bread never rose properly since she started timing it by chimes. "The dough knows better than iron," she muttered, folding her arms. A few towns saw minor uprisings, laborers striking against hour-rate work, claiming it cheated them of the old ways, when time was measured by effort, not iron teeth. But the clock kept ticking. because the thing about mechanical clocks is they don't stop for opinion. And soon, their numbers grew. Clocks go public by the end of the 14th century. Nearly every major town in Europe had at least one mechanical clock. Some even added faces, big dials with moving hands. Villagers gathered to watch them turn, stunned to see time move before their eyes. Some called it witch's glass. Others said it was a mirror into the mind of God. Clocks became symbols of prestige. Towns competed over who had the largest, most accurate, or most musical device. Bells multiplied, some chiming every quarter hour. A few added automata, little figures that danced or rang hammers at the stroke of noon. Children loved them. So did mayors, and so gradually villagers learned to trust the sound of time. They scheduled births, they buried the dead, they prayed, worked, and gathered not at sunrise or sundown, but at the 6th hour, even if they didn't fully understand the wheels inside. They accepted the rhythm outside, and yet, as you sit by the bakery window, bread cooling beside you, and the bell rings, its even echoing note, you find yourself wondering, was this progress or a trade? Did we gain clarity by the hour, or lose something that only silence once kept? When time became a master, the bell tolls midnight that echoes across the rooftops, bouncing from inn to apothecary, slipping down alleys, passing through closed shutters and sleeping ears. A dog barks once in response. A baker stirs, not quite awake. A drunkard mutters something about curfews. No one looks at the sky. The clock has spoken, and that perhaps is the final proof that something has changed. A life once unmeasured, a generation. We go. No one knew what midnight was. They said the dark middle or deepest night, or just slept through it entirely. Time was approximate. No need to name hours that didn't serve a purpose. But now time has labels, numbers, structure. Time has shape. You measure things differently. Where once a father taught his son to work the plow until the light fades, now he says, until the 7th hour. A town meeting is no longer after mass, but at the 3rd bell. Two lovers, once parted by the rhythm of day and feeling, now part because the hour says they must. The clock doesn't just ring, it regulates. It reshapes choices. It standardizes experience. It turns time from a setting into a system, and people adapt. Clocks, as status-wealthy merchants begin installing smaller clocks in their homes, spring-driven, compact, imported from Italy or the Low Countries. They are decorative, temperamental, sometimes wildly inaccurate, but beautiful. To own a personal clock is to say, I am modern, I command time. Guildhalls and universities follow suit. One monastery designs a clock that not only marks the hour but also shows the phases of the moon and the position of the planets. It becomes a pilgrimage site not for prayer, but for awe. Even kings take. Notai CEA 14th century French noble commissions a clock that chimes every hour, but also plays music and features a mechanical angel who bows each morning that the angel is faulty, but no one minds. Because now, even heaven keeps time. The clock, and the soul, but deeper questions begin to stir. If the clock orders the day, where does the soul go? Monks begin debating whether praying on time is more important than praying with focus. Philosophers ask if dividing time divides the spirit. Can you be fully present in the 3rd hour if your mind waits only for the 4th? In villages, people begin dreaming of clocks, not metaphorically, literally. There are stories of farmers who hear the bell in their sleep, of mothers who wake moments before the chime, of children who play games guessing how many seconds before the clock will strike. Time has become a presence, not quite divine, but not entirely mechanical. Either it is felt, not by sunlight or gut or sky, but by rhythm, unforgiving, perfect, and strange. Stillness between the strikes, yet even now, there are moments when the old time returns. You sit in a field, waiting for the harvest to ripen, and no bell rings. You lie in bed, awake before dawn, and watch the light creep across the floor. You walk through the forest, far from the towers, clang, and remember a time when time was marked by birdsong and footfall, not iron years. And in those moments, you wonder, was there ever a time when time was yours? Not the bells, not the mayors, not the merchants, just yours. And if there was, can you still find it? In the quiet hour between midnight and dawn, when the gears rest and the world forgets to listen, might that still be yours? He Ottoman gardeners who wrote poetry about tulips, section 1, the flower that ruled an empire. Oh, the tulip is quiet. It makes no sound as it opens, no dramatic unfurling, no scent loud enough to declare itself. It simply appears upright, composed, intensely colored, and waits to be noticed. On 18th century Istanbul, everyone noticed that because the tulip wasn't just a flower. It was fashion, it was metaphor, it was empire, it was policy. And behind every prized blossom there was a gardener dressed in simple robes, tools tucked into his sash, composing couplets in Ottoman Turkish as he gently guided a bloom toward perfection. You may have imagined court life in Istanbul as full of velvet, silk, or scholars, and it was. But also, it was full of flowers, and no flower held more power than the tulip, a city in bloom. The year is 1718. You walk through the gardens of Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's great residence, that looks down over the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia nod politely at one another across the water. It's evening, the call to prayer has just faded. The lamps are being lit, and everywhere you look, tulips they line the paths, crowd the beds, spill from painted ceramic pots. Some are deep crimson, others pale apricot, some striped like flames, others so dark they look black beneath the moonlight. Tulips in the palace, tulips in the streets, tulips in the fountains that flow with perfumed water, tulips woven into silk robes, stitched into slippers, painted into the margins of miniature manuscripts. You glance at a passing official sash. Even there a tulip embroidered in gold thread, and nearby, a gardener kneels beside a row of delicate, pink blooms, trims gently, muttering lines of poetry under his breath. He is not merely maintaining the grounds, he is participating in an imperial aesthetic. Lael Devri the Tulip Erithis is the Lael Devri the Tulip Erithli 1718 to 1730. It's a brief, intoxicating moment in Ottoman history where art, architecture, poetry, and diplomacy all bloom together, a time of relative peace, open trade, and curious indulgence. The tulip became the unofficial symbol of the age. Why? Partly for its rarity. The most coveted tulip bulbs came from Central Asia, Persia, and the Anatolian highlands. They were fragile, difficult to breed, and wildly unpredictable. You could plant 100 bulbs and get 100 surprises. No two blooms the same. But that was the point. The tulip became a symbol of ephemeral beauty, of the brief, perfect thing, a metaphor rooted in Sufi poetry, which saw in the tulip not just color, but divine longing. Even the word Lael tulip in Ottoman Turkish shares the same letters as Allah when rearranged, an echo not lost on the palace poets, the gardeners as poets now. Imagine yourself among them. You are a palace gardener, but your job is more than dirt and watering cans. You must understand beauty. You must observe, reflect, compose. It's expected that you write poetry short, devotional, metaphor-rich. You don't publish, you don't boast, you simply leave. Verses tucked under stones, in tool drawers, along the edges of ledgers. A few examples survive. Each tulip sways like a dancer of Mevli grace, whirling beneath the gaze of night's soft face. Or briefest breath, my garden blooms, and yet in it, the heavens find their rooms. You know your flowers by names passed down like royalty. Blood of the martyr, shame of the rose, yellow dawn, blush of the sultana you record there. Patterns, you crossbreed them, you test new arrangements. You work under silence but with immense care. And at night, when your hands are stained with soil and your robes smell faintly of hyacinth and tarragon, you sit in the shade of the courtyard and write, he who prunes with love, prays with petals. You are not famous, but your tulips are. They travel to elite homes, to poetry salons, to foreign embassies. You've heard that in Holland they worship these flowers too, that their tulip craze nearly ruined an economy. You smile, fools, for you. The tulip was never coined, it was memory, it was breath, it was time, blooming. And sometimes you wonder when the empire forgets to water its gardens. What else might wither with the tulips? When flowers meant power, it's early morning in Istanbul. The mist still clings to the Bosphorus, and the tulips school from the nightstand tall in their beds. The gardeners walk the paths silently, brushing dew from the petals, snipping errant leaves, arranging blooms by hue and height. You are among them. Your hands are inked, not from miscare but from writing. Last night, after tending the terrace beds, you composed a short verse in the margin of your garden log. Between each tulip reads a prayer/one bloom for each unspoken care. You didn't intend for anyone to read it. But this morning the Hazenadar, the palace treasurer, pauses at your row and gestures at your inked note. He says nothing, just nods. You've just joined a tradition, quiet, intimate, oddly powerful, because in the tulip era, flowers weren't just grown, they were read. Petals as palazzi in the 18th century Ottoman court. Tastes mattered, and tulips were the taste. Courtiers judged one another not by military conquest or administrative prowess, but by garden arrangement. A sultan who showed restraint in his tulip beds was seen as modest, elegant, wise. A vizier who produced garish or overplanted displays risked being thought vulgar, impatient, or nouveau rich. There were unspoken rules. Tulips must be planted in rosebud, not too rigid. Colors must complement, not compete. Blooming times should stagger, creating a cascading visual over several weeks. These displays weren't private, no, they were opened like exhibitions. Wealthy homes invited guests to evening tulip viewings. Oil lamps would be hung at ground level to illuminate the petals from beneath. Poetry would be recited, sherbet served. Music played softly. Diplomats were impressed. It was as if the empire had found a way to speak without words, to use gardens as declarations. Even the Grand Vizier, Nivavaherli Demot Ibrahim Pasha, famously planned entire urban projects, fountains, parks, pavilions around tulip seasons. He promoted public gardens, planted flower beds along promenades. He wanted beauty to reach the people. And you, as a gardener, were part of that movement. You didn't just maintain flowers, you managed meaning, poetry, and petals. But not all tulips were equal. Some varieties were rarer than others. Some had striped petals caused by a virus, though no one knew it at the time, which made them highly prized. These broken tulips became coveted, their bulbs worth more than a servant's monthly pay. You recall once being given a bulb rose of the hidden moon, a pale, shimmering bloom with a ghost-like stripe. You planted it in secret, nurtured it, watched it rise when it bloomed. You wrote, "Not all beauty shouts. Some leans in silence, pale as prayer, full of defiance." You left the note tucked in the garden ledger. The next day your bulb was gone, replanted perhaps in the Sultan's private garden. No one mentioned it. But a week later, a copy of your poem appeared calligraphed in gold leaf on the corner of a page in the palace court journal. It's not theft, you thought, it's acknowledgement that the empire runs on such things. The politics of blooming but beauty has a shelf life. By 1725, criticism was brewing. Some said the empire had grown soft, too obsessed with gardens and silken fountains, that the palace spent too much on tulips and too little on soldiers. Poets began to write darker verses. While petals rise, the walls fall thin, let not the tulip hide our sin. Some tulip varieties were mocked for their names. One was called Envy of the Nightingale, another, the Pearl of Exile. People began to murmur, "Are we flowers now, or rulers still?" There were price controls issued on bulbs, secret fines, grumbling in coffee houses. Tulips, once symbols of refinement, began to feel like excess. You feel it too. The joy is still there, but now tinged with anxiety. You begin keeping your verses to yourself again. Still, every evening you water, you prune, you walk the rows and whisper, "Though the breeze forgets my name, let each bloom rise just the same." You do your work quietly. You tend the beauty, but you wonder when a flower becomes a symbol of power. Can it still be loved for itself, or does it bend, just slightly, under the weight of meaning? Petals after the fall. It is spring again in Istanbul, but the air feels heavier this year, the breeze less fragrant. The tulips bloom, as they always have, but now, the silence around them is different. You, the gardener, still rise early, still trim the stalks, straighten the beds, sweep the garden paths of fallen petals. Your fingers still know the names of every bloom, but your poetry, you do not leave it lying out anymore, because the tulip era has ended. And not gently. The uprising among the petals, it came suddenly. In 1730, a rebellion, led not by scholars or rival princes, but by Patrona Halal, a former janissary in bathhouse, worker. The people, angered by years of perceived excess, high taxes, and a sultan more interested in flower shows than frontier wars, rose up. They stormed the city. Fountains were smashed, palaces looted, officials dragged from gardens and killed in public. The Grand Vizier Neveve Hurli, Daimut Ibrahim Pasha, the man who built gardens like sonnets, was executed, and the tulips, their beds were torn up, bulbs crushed, public plantings uprooted. For weeks afterward, the streets of Istanbul bore the scent not of spring bloom, but of wilt and mud and rage. The people had decided, no more tulips, the flower that became a memory. And so the Sultan Nom III was deposed. His successors ruled more cautiously. Budgets shrank, poetry waned. No new fountains rose, gardens were simplified, standardized. The city grew grayer, but you, quiet, patient, you continued your work. You trimmed what few beds remained. The old trees still dropped blossoms. Wild tulips sometimes appeared by the city walls, growing where forgotten bulbs had been tossed. And in the smaller courtyards of minor officials, gardens began to slowly return. Less showy, more personal. A simple, yellow bloom, tucked behind a stone basin, a half-stripped stem curling from an alley pot. The flower had not been at fault. It had only bloomed gardens in extra years past. You grew older one spring. You visited an estate. Outside Edronder, you found a small garden planted by the daughter of a former court official. She had salvaged tulip bulbs during the rebellion, hid them, kept them alive. She asked you to walk the garden. You did, quietly with reverence. At the far edge, beside a cedar bench, bloomed a tulip you hadn't seen in 20 years. Rose of the hidden moon. She asked if you knew its name. You smiled, nodded, and that night, by lamplight, you wrote again. You cannot bury light in soil. It finds the root. It lifts the coil. You did not sign it. You never did, but you left a note on the bench in the morning. It was gone, and weeks later, when passing a bookseller in Galata, you saw a slim volume of anonymous poems titled Petals After the Storm. No author listed, just verses. About gardens, about empire, about remembering the tulip as goods. Now, as the empire marches onward toward new wars, new treaties, new inventions, the memory of the tulip era becomes misty, almost mythic. Students recite poems about it. Artists paint imagined gardens. Foreigners collect tulip motifs, unaware of their full story. And in some quiet corners of Istanbul, near crumbling fountains or beneath olive trees, old gardeners still murmur lines as they tend small beds. Not for show, not for policy, just for the flower itself. Because even after politics fade and rebellions pass, even after memory loses its shape, The tulip still blooms. Umbotthered. Upright. And somehow, still whispering in every age, a flower leans toward light it never fully sees. And sometimes, as you close your eyes in your small courtyard, you wonder, if beauty once brought a city to ruin, might it someday rebuild one too? The Forgotten Gold Rush of Siberian River Traders Section 1. Paddling into fortune, the river is quiet, wide, and slow. Its banks are lined with birch and pine. The wind smells like snow, even though spring has technically arrived. You are seated in a long, flat-bottomed boater's drug, the kind used by Russian fur traders, hunters, and monks for centuries. You are not heading to a city. You are heading into the taiga. You grip the paddle. It's heavy. The water is thick with silt. Behind you, your fellow traders murmur quietly. The boat creaks. The river swirls brown and glassy. It's the year 1832, and you are one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of men quietly migrating east into Siberia. Not for furs this time, but for something even older. Gold. Before California, before Klondike. People think gold rush. They usually imagine San Francisco in 1849, or the Yukon in the 1890s. Grizzled men with pickaxes, canvas tents, and pans swirling in ice-cold streams. But the first major gold rush of the 19th century, that happened in Siberia. And no one remembers it. In the early 1800s, as the Russian Empire pushed deeper into its vast frozen interior, surveyors and soldiers began noticing unusual rocks along certain riverbanks, shimmering grains, strange glints. In this, reports trickled in. By 1829, a merchant named Lev Bruznitsin working near the Yenisei River made a quiet fortune after discovering a sandbar dense with gold-bearing gravel. Word spread. But slowly. Russia, after all, was not a place with newspapers and shouting headlines. In Siberia, it was barely governed. It was, in many ways, a map of blankness. Still, the merchants came. The hunters turned miners. The exiles turned guides. By the early 1830s, fleets of strugs and barges were pushing deeper into the interior rivers, Lena Vitium and beyond. They called themselves Zulato-Promyshlenik gold industrialists, but most were just rivermen. Gold in the silt. You reach a shallow bend where the current slows. The banks are muddy, the water clearer. You and your crew push the boat ashore, hop into the riverbed, and begin the slow, meditative work of panning. It's nothing fancy. You scoop river gravel into a wide, flat panmore, like a basin, then the cowboy-style pans you might be picturing. You swirl it gently, letting the water carry off the lighter sand and rock. What's left? Heavy grains. And sometimes a flash of yellow. You tap it with your knife. It's soft, it's real, and it's yours. Gold in it. Siberia wasn't found in massive veins or quartz cliffs. It was placer gold, loose, ancient bits washed down from mountains, gathered in beds, caught in silt. This made it accessible to almost anyone with patience, strong arms, and a willingness to endure mosquitoes, frostbite, and solitude. The empire encouraged it. In 1814, Tsar Alexander I declared Siberian gold the property of private discoverers, provided they registered their claims and paid modest royalties. It was a rare moment of near-capitalism in an otherwise rigid, autocratic society. For once, peasants and merchants alike had a chance to strike it rich, and many did. Quietly out of sight of Moscow, that floating camps. You camp on the riverbank for a week. You build simple lean-tos from pine boughs, smoke fish, patch your boots with felt. There are no roads, no towns, just a network of floating camps, temporary gold communities that drifted with the river and the season. Each camp had its own rhythm. Some were rough, lawless, tense. Others were oddly civil. Men wrote poems, played cards, even kept journals of their findings. One early prospector described the Yenisei River's goldfields as a mirror for the soul, showing both greed and quiet joy. At night, you and the others huddle by the fire. You tally your grains, your specks, your tiny flakes. Some hide them in the seams of coats. Others stitch them into belts or hollowed-out boot heels. You've heard stories of men who found enough to return home, buy a shop, marry well, of others who were found face down in the water, gold sewn into their socks, and still more who never returned at all. But you're not thinking of that tonight. Tonight, you look up at the stars, sharp bright, eternal, and wonder how many empires lie waiting in the silt of forgotten rivers. Fortune without a map. You wake before dawn. The river mists are still low and white, curling around the boats like ghosts. Your hands are stiff from cold and work. Your pan is dented, your boots wet through, and yet you're smiling. Yesterday, your basin yielded nearly a spoonful of gold dust, enough to buy a year's bread and enough to make the journey feel worth it. But you don't go home, not yet, because no one here really leaves after the first lucky strike. You simply move further upriver. You follow rumors, you follow instinct, you follow the gold. Life along the river's asterisk. The Siberian gold rush didn't build towns overnight. It didn't give rise to frontier cities or new states. It gave rise to roots, fluid, changing, seasonal, a kind of floating world. Each river had its own culture. The Lena was known for tight-knit camps and hard winters, the Yenisei for larger finds and even larger thefts. The Alden deep in the east was a whisper, a legend, Men spoke of it around fires, but few had been. The empire marked them on maps, but vaguely. There were few official roads, fewer stations, no police. If you were robbed, cheated, or abandoned, your only witness was the wind. But also, your only master was the river. Many traders felt freer here than anywhere else in the empire. Even exile settlers, once sentenced to Siberia, joined the rush. Cossacks, Tatars, escaped serfs, Mongol guides, Yakut trackers, they all mingled in these makeshift gold flotillas, and among them more often than you'd think were women. Not many, but some disguised, determined, often widowed or traveling with husbands, became adept miners and panors. There are stories of a Yakut woman who earned more gold than any 10 men in her camp. She weighed with fishing, weights and baked it into bread loaves for smuggling. She disappeared, downriver in 1837. No one knows what became of her. Some say she made it to China, others say she drowned. But in the songs sung by boatmen decades later, she was a legend. The quiet fortunes have been working for months now. You have a pouch not full, but heavy enough to clink. Some flakes are flattened into beads, others kept loose, wrapped in oiled cloth. You're planning your return, a stop in Karensk, then south to Krasnoyarsk, maybe a ticket west to Tomsk, maybe even all the way back to Moscow maybe. But part of you hesitates. Because once you leave the river, the gold becomes complicated. It must be declared, weighed, registered. You must pay fees, sign ledgers, explain how you got it. The empire likes gold, but it likes it counted. Some traders manage this. They partner with registered merchants or bribe river officials. A few set up legal operations, registered mines, hired labor, official stamps, but most vanish back into the trees. They hide their wealth, smuggle it out slowly, or bury it until a safer time. Not because they fear punishment, but because they fear being noticed in Siberia. Anonymity is safer than affluence. You recall a saying you heard early on. The river gives, but she watches, and she does not like. Boasting from trade to control still. Word spread. By the 1840s, the government realized just how much gold was flowing out of the taiga. They sent more officials, built rudimentary stations, began requiring licensing for all mining activity. Traders were encouraged but quietly pressured to register. Prices for gold were regulated. Taxes increased. The number of accidents among lone prospectors began to rise. You heard about a man, Pavel, from the Alden Basin, who struck a vein the size of a candle. He tried to register it. The claim was lost in the paperwork. He vanished the next week. His boat was found empty, adrift. His shovel was gone, but his boots were still in the bottom of the hole. Gold and silence. You keep panning. You keep quiet. You bury half your pouch beneath a stone near a bend you'll recognize by 2 crooked birches. You'll mark it in your own way 4 scratches on the hull of your boat. Not a map. Not quite. Just a memory, encoded. And as you paddle further upstream, the water's colder, the air sharper, the pine trees thicker. You think, how many fortunes were left behind in Siberia, not lost, but deliberately hidden. Not because they weren't real, but because naming them would have meant losing them. The river keeps its secrets. The river is still moving, even as the empire slows. It's 1856 now. The Crimean War has ended in defeat. Russia's economy is strained, its army exhausted. And back in the imperial capital, ministers argue over reforms, conscriptions, debts, and maps they barely understand. But out here, in the folds of taiga and tundra, the paddles keep dipping, the river keeps whispering, and somewhere beneath, the gravel still there is gold. You are no longer a novice. Your beard has silver in it now. Your hands are calloused in the same places, but the muscles have settled. You don't talk much. You listen. You watch the riverbed. You scan the shoreline for the telltale shape of a sandbar, for the color of the silt, and you think more and more often not about riches, but about returning. Maybe not to a city, but to a place you can stay, somewhere inland, quiet, where the trees outnumber the rules. The end of an open era by the mid-1850s. The Russian state had formalized most of Siberia's goldfields. The licenses were stricter now. The tax is higher. Gold had become a strategic asset, not just a merchant's fantasy. Large operations were forming, some state-run, some backed by noble families. They brought in hired labor, official inspectors, engineers from Moscow, but they also brought chain gangs. Because by this point, the state had realized, if you need gold, and you control tens of thousands of prisoners, why not put them to work? Convict labor flooded into the Siberian interior. The romance of the lone trader was replaced by the clank of shackles and the scrape of forced labor in gravel pits. Guard towers, whips, rations, gold. Once a whisper was now a command, and those who'd once come freely, they slipped away. You among them, you bury your last pouch, not for safety, but because you're done. You've panned enough to buy land, or at least a cabin. You know which bend of the river will keep its silence, and you've made peace with the fact that your name will not be in any history, only your oiled coat, your bent paddle. And maybe, someday, the strange glint in the dirt where someone else decides to dig. The memory that fades like frost years pass, The gold rush is remembered as a footnote, a phase, a line in a report sent to the Tsar's desk. It never becomes legend. There are no songs, no great novels, no painted panoramas of bearded men grinning over pans. There is only the river, and its watchers. You become one of them, an old man in a cabin who once knew where the gold was, who sometimes shows others how to swirl a pan just so, who sometimes tells stories by firelight that sound too gentle to be true, and on certain spring mornings, goes back to the bend in the river where the birch trees lean like old friends. You don't dig, you just sit, and listen, because some gold is never meant to be taken. Some riches are made of memory, and some rivers keep their secrets. I once knew a place where the sand glittered, but I forgot the name, and the river preferred it that way. And as you let your paddle rest across your knees, sun dappling the water, you wonder how many other stories shimmer quietly beneath history's visceral, unclaimed, and waiting for someone to drift by, look down, and notice them. Let's now leave the icy rivers behind and step softly into the sun-warmed corridors of ancient Egypt, where silence hummed with ink, papyrus whispered under practiced hands, and a broken writing brush could make or break a royal decree. Story 12. Why ancient Egyptian scribes always carried a spare brush, the brush that held a kingdom together. The Nile is calm today, its waters shimmer in the heat, gently parting around fishing boats and reed skiffs. Beyond its banks, date palms sway slowly, cicadas buzz in the distance, and the white limestone walls of the palace catch the afternoon sun. Inside, it is cooler. You walk barefoot across smooth floors. Your linen tunic brushes your knees. You carry a slim wooden case, no longer than your forearm, tied shut with twine. Inside are small cakes of pigment, a pot of black ink, and 2 fragile writing brushes made from split rushes and chewed reed. You are a scribe, and the pharaoh is waiting, writing in a world of stone. In ancient Egypt, more than 3,000 years before the first printing press, the written word was sacred, powerful, and painfully fragile. Every decree, every tax order, every grain inventory, funeral spell, love poem, temple record, and military report had to be written by hand with delicate tools, on fragile materials, under punishing conditions. That there were no backups, no erasers, and most importantly, no forgiveness for mistakes. So scribes, highly trained, deeply respected, often feared, always carried a spare brush. Because the scribe's job was not simply to copy words, it was to hold the state together. The school of sharp ice. You were not born a scribe, you became one. At 7, you were selected, maybe for your family's connections, maybe for your clear handwriting, maybe just because you could sit still longer than the other boys. You were taken to the House of Life, the scriptorium and training academy attached to a major temple. There you learned to read and write hieratically simplified, cursive version of hieroglyphs used for everyday documents. Later, if you were especially gifted, you'd be taught hieroglyphs proper, the sacred writing used in tombs and temples. You practiced on limestone. Flakes is trochus scraping off errors with a sharp shell. Mistakes were not allowed. One popular student phrase from the Middle Kingdom reads, "A scribe's path is long, but his pen reaches eternity," which sounds noble, until you realize it was probably repeated as punishment, line after line. For poor penmanship, your brush was made from a single stalk of reed cut, split, softened by chewing. The brush that held a kingdom together, you learned to trim it just right, not too soft or it would collapse in the ink, not too sharp or it would tear the delicate papyrus. You tested it by writing the word ma'at, truth, balance, order, if the strokes were clean, if the lines held their rhythm. The brush was ready. If not, you reached for your spare, because the brush wasn't just your pen, it was your lifeline, and Egypt had no shortage of things that needed writing. A world written by hand each day. Thousands of records passed through the hands of scribes. At granaries, scribes recorded how much wheat was stored, how much was spoiled, and how much was distributed. At temples, scribes copied hymns, spells, and donor lists. In the military, scribes noted supplies, troop numbers, and orders from the high command. In the palace, scribes drafted correspondence for the pharaoh himself, some of which would be sent to kings in Mesopotamia or Hittite lands, folded and sealed in clay. There were scribes for everything: tax scribes, court scribes, agricultural scribes, tomb scribes. You did not speak your mind. You did not alter the message. You were the ink that carried authority, not the voice behind it. And when your brush broke midline, you didn't panic. You simply reached for the second one. You'd soaked it the night before, trimmed it with care. A good scribe always prepared their tools like a priest, preparing incense, reverently, precisely, and with deep attention. To forget a spare was shameful. To run out of ink was inexcusable. To blot a royal name, that could cost you your career or worse. So you kept the case close. Always the scribe's place in society, though rarely seen by the public. Scribes were everywhere. They weren't nobles, but they weren't commoners either. They were in between, educated, respected, and feared just enough to be left alone. You could read what others could not. You could interpret temple rituals, decode market prices, and transcribe a will so cleverly that it favored your patron without being detected. And because papyrus was costly and rare, Your handwriting was precious. Each page mattered. Each line had to be even aligned, smooth like water flowing down a channel. A single mistake might require the entire sheet to be redone. So yes, you always carried a spare brush, but you also carried something else, a memory, for every line you'd ever written, in case you had to recreate it without delay. You were a walking archive, and at times you felt more paper than man. A whisper of eternity tonight. You write by lamplight. Your ink is nearly gone. You've written out an offering list for a minor priest's tomb: 5 ducks, 3 measures of beer, 1 basket of figs. It's not an important commission, but it's paid. You write the god's name slowly, with care. Your brush splays slightly. You stop. Do not risk it. You reach for the second brush, dip it, steady your hand, write the last line, that his name may endure, and his provisions not fail, in the western field. And as you blow gently across the ink to dry it, you wonder, when I am gone, and this paper remains, who will carry the brush then? And will they still remember to bring a spare? Ink, status, and the weight of the word. You are older now. Your fingers no longer tremble when you sign your name. You write with the relaxed speed of someone who knows his characters so well he no longer sees them as symbols, their gestures, muscle memory, extensions of thought. But still, you carry your writing case each day. Still tuck 2 brushes under. The twine still whisper a small breath before writing the name of a god, a pharaoh or a noblewoman's father, because words still matter and your job is to make them last. The weight of a title in the great hall of the record office. You sit among rows of other scribes, each with their own desk, their own lamp, their own papyrus quota for the day. A carved wooden cartouche hangs above the entrance. It reads, "The hand that writes commands the tongue that speaks." And here, that's true. A poorly recorded deed can strip a man of his land. An official's title, written 1 sign too low, can start a feud. A single forgotten symbol in a tomb. Text might send a soul wandering, unable to reach the fields of reeds. You've been summoned today to revise a priest's lineage. A new cousin has been discovered. The family insists he be added to the funerary scroll. The scroll is long, the ink faded in places. You unroll it, carefully crackling softly in the hot air, and scan for space. None. You sigh. That will take it. Rewrite. You reach for your brush, and then you stop. It's been trimmed too short. The bristles are stiff. You can feel it in your fingers. Without looking, you reach for the spare. This one is better, softer, familiar. You dip it in the black ink and begin. Not because you want to, but because only you can. The ink economy behind every graceful line of hieratic script, there is a system. Brushes made of rush or sedge, trimmed to fine points, and chewed at the end to split the fibers just enough. Pigments ground by hand, lamp black for ink, red ochre for emphasis, sometimes malachite for rare green, papyrus imported in rolls, pressed and dried near the delta, and stored in clay jars sealed against insects. Every stroke has a cost, every sheet a ledger. Scribes, therefore, became careful, not only with words but with materials. You recycled sheets when you could, turned rejected scrolls into practice boards, collected ink flakes and re-wetted them for personal letters. You once heard of a scribe who kept a hidden tin of rare blue pigment lapis lazuli, imported from far-off Bactria. He used it only for sacred names, and only when alone, he claimed. It made the gods listen harder. You don't know if that's true, but you understand the sentiment, because sometimes, writing feels like whispering into eternity and hoping eternity has ears. The brush as a lifeline. You still remember the time you forgot your spare. You were a junior clerk then, assigned to copy a shipment order for the treasury. A simple list, grain dates. Linen bolt spot halfway through the second column. Your brush split. You panicked. The ink bled across the page. You tried to trim the brush with a fingernail. Failed. Asked to borrow one. Denied. Spent the rest of the day recopying the entire sheet that night. You carved a new brush, and promised yourself never again. Since then, you've made it a ritual. Every week, you chew to new brushes to the perfect softness, wrap them in linen and slip them into your case. Each morning, before lifting the inkstone lid, you press the bristles between your fingers to test the point. And each time, before you write the sacred sign for life, you pause for just a moment, out of habit, out of memory, out of respect, because you are not simply recording events, you are carving breath into silence. And you sometimes wonder if the gods read our words. Do they also remember who held the brush, or only what was written with it? Writing beyond the tomb, the day is quiet. The heat outside is sharp, but in the scriptorium, the air is still and cool. You work by habit, now according the transfer of cloth bolts from one temple storeroom to another. There's nothing poetic about it, no sacred names, just cargo and numbers, but still, you take your time. Still you check the brush, still you line the columns neatly, so that any reader, years from now, will understand what was stored, when and why. Because this, like all writing in Egypt, is not just for the present, it is for forever. Scribes in the afterlife of the Egyptians believed deeply in the power of writing to shape not just the world of the living but the world of the dead. To write something was to give it permanence. To leave a name unwritten was to allow it to vanish. This is why tombs were lined with inscriptions, why canopic jars bore labels, why spells were copied, in full, again and again, onto funerary scrolls tucked into coffins. The Book of the Dead, not a single volume, but a tradition, was written by scribes like you, often by commission. Rich families would pay for personalized scrolls filled with instructions and magical texts to help guide the soul through the underworld. You've written many, and each time you wondered, will someone write one for me when it's my turn? There are rumors that some scribes made their own scrolls, quietly, over years, writing out spells between jobs, hiding their names and acrostics, selecting their favorite hymns and blessings like seeds planted in secret. You don't know if you believe that, but you have a small jar tucked in your quarters. Inside, a single brush, 3 sheets of scrap papyrus, and 1 line, written years ago, "Let my hand not falter in the hole of mat." You wrote it after copying a spell one afternoon, just for yourself. You've kept it ever since, just in case. Legacy in the margin CAR. Not famous. You don't write for the royal court. You've never carved a name into stone, but across Egypt. Scrolls exist with your handwriting on them, ledgers, inventories, family trees, trade receipts, a few hymns. They're in temple libraries, tax offices, even sealed in tombs beneath limestone hills. You think about that? Sometimes how your words will outlive your voice, how someone centuries or millennia from now may brush sand from a scroll and read your lines aloud without knowing who you were, and maybe, if they read carefully enough, they'll notice the moment where the ink changes slightly, where the stroke becomes smoother, where the brush was swapped, and maybe they'll wonder, was this when the scribe reached for the spare? The last stroke today, you finish early. You rinse your brush, dry it in the sun, wrap it in linen and place it gently in its case. Then, without fanfare, you take out the spare. You inspect it. It's slightly warped but usable. You smile, set it aside, and for the first time in decades, you don't need it. You leave it behind on your desk, a quiet signature, a gift for the next pair of hands that takes your place. Because in Egypt, the brush is never buried. It waits, it listens, it remembers. And as you step out into the white sun, the scent of ink still clinging to your fingertips, you wonder if a scribe writes his way into eternity. Does he ever truly leave? The Lost Art of Aztec Featherworking, Section 1. When birds built an Empetoreth, morning begins with birdsong, not distant, not in trees but inside the workshop. Parrots mutter softly in wicker cages. Hummingbirds dart between clay pots of sweet syrup. And in one corner a solemn man carefully unrolls a cotton cloth layered with iridescent feathers, green, gold, crimson, indigo, arranged like scales, gleaming in the light. You are his apprentice, and today, you are learning to sew the sky. A craft fit for gods in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan before the Spanish ever set foot in the valley. Feathers were not just decoration. They were a currency of meaning, more precious than gold, more symbolic than stone. Feathers clothed gods, kings, and warriors. Feathers told stories. Feathers were tribute, and featherworkers a Montagu were among the most respected artisans. In the empire you come from a long line of them. Your father's hands shook when he first taught you how to tease apart the tail feathers of the quetzal, the resplendent bird from the southern rainforests. Not to pluck, never to pluck, but to harvest, carefully, keeping the feather whole. Each one was a line of poetry, a shimmer of breath. Each one was accounted for, because no material in the empire was more tightly controlled than feathers. The marketplace of plumage every 5 days. In the great market of Tlatelolco, thousands gathered to trade food, tools, pottery, and feathers. Not just the rare green of the quetzal, but blue macaw, yellow oriole, pink spoonbill, red ibis. Traders brought sacks of them tied with reeds, separated by size and origin. Some were sold loose, others bundled. And some of all were still attached to the bird, because the most delicate feathers could only be removed alive, and only by those who had trained for years in the art of non-lethal plucking. The feather market was a symphony of color. Even the Pochiticatha, elite merchant class, traded in them, bringing birdskins and feathers from as far as modern-day Honduras and Guatemala. And from those feathers, the Amanteca built shields for warriors, adorned with flame-colored plumes, fans and parasols for nobles, headdresses that towered like flames, woven into diadems, panels and cloaks that shimmered like whetstone in sunlight, and most importantly, icons for the gods. A sacred duty. You are 10 years old. Your master gives you your first task, to arrange hummingbird feathers in a pattern for a small shield. He tells you not to sneeze. You laugh until you nearly do, because the feathers are lighter than thought. They move if you breathe too hard. They cling to your fingers with static. They vanish into the cracks in the floor if you drop them. You steady your hands. Use a bit of heated tree sap zigly to fix the first one in place, then the second, then the third. It takes hours, but by sunset, you've completed a perfect half circle shifting in blues and purples. Your master nods. It is a small thing, but in this empire, even small things are sacred. He reminds you that Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, the war god, was once a hummingbird, and every feather you place is an offering. The emperor's cape one afternoon. Messengers arrive. They carry a commission. The emperor himself requires a new cloak, one that will echo the colors of sunrise over Lake Texcoco. 100 feather workers will contribute. Your master has been chosen for the collar. You are allowed to help only by sorting feathers for days. You run your fingers through green quetzal plumes, searching for those with just the right curvature. Your hands smell like birds and resin and sun-warmed cloth. The final cloak is so radiant it seems lit from within. When the emperor wears it to the great temple steps, a hush falls. Even the priests pause. And that evening, as the city quiets, your master says, one feather alone is a bird, but 1,000 placed in order that is memory, and you begin to wonder if we lose the birds. Do we also lose the stories they told? The weavers of wind and color, you rise before dawn, not to hunt, but to sort. The workshop is already warm. You unwrap bundles of feathers kept sealed in beeswax, cloth to preserve their texture, and begin to sift. Quetzal for emerald, macaw for sapphire, heron for silver sheen. Each feather is laid flat, stroked once, then stacked by size. Today's commission is difficult. A ceremonial fan for a priest who claims to dream of rain. He wants cloud colors, which means white ibis for softness, spotted gull for shadows, and a line of yellow canary to suggest where the sun might be hiding. The challenge is not the color, it's the silence, because featherwork is a craft of absolute stillness. You must not shake the table. You must not exhale too sharply. You must press each feather into beeswax, paste in such a way that no glue shows and the feather lies flush with its neighbors, and the angle catches the light in just the right way. This is not sewing. This is choreography. Each layer a ripple, each shape a suggestion. The finished fan will not move, but it will look as if it might lift off the priest's hand and float upward to meet the gods. The feather masters of Amatlanyu VA heard stories of the Amanteca, live deeper in the highlands beyond the stone causeways, near the forests where the quetzal still nests wild. They do not come to market. They do not share their techniques, but their pieces arrive sometimes, carried by traders wrapped in woven mats, headdresses shaped like jaguar heads, caped mantles that ripple like water even when still one piece so finely worked it could be mistaken for a painting was said to contain 2,000 feathers from 27 different birds, layered with such precision that each movement of the wearer made it shift like fire. You saw it once, briefly, at a temple festival. It was carried, not worn, because to wear it would be to change. It dotted, no one dared. Your master called it a tapestry of breath. You believed him, because when it passed you, something in the air shifted as if the workshop itself had exhaled. Tribute in feathers. As the Aztec Empire grew, so too did the demand for feathers. Tribute lists from conquered cities often demanded, not silver, not jade, but feathers. Bundles of them, measured by the thousand, sorted by species and color, delivered monthly or yearly to the central warehouses. The tax for one city might read 800 bundles of red macaw feathers, 400 bundles of heron down, 40 capes adorned in quetzal, one shield covered in hummingbird blue asterisk. The flow of feathers became a kind of soft river, radiant, silent, and constant, and with it came more artisans, more workshops, more hands trained to pluck, sort, clean, layer, and bind. You were no longer rare, but your craft remained sacred, because in an empire so vast, so battle-scarred, so full of ceremony and smoke, there were still things made only for beauty, not to be worn into war, not to frighten enemies, but to remind the gods that the world was still beautiful, and that the people still remembered how to offer sky back to sky. The knife beside the brushbud. Not all commissions are peaceful. Sometimes a warrior comes into the workshop and requests a headdress of blood plumed in red ibis to honor a fallen brother, or a shield, half black, half yellow, to show the sun and death locked in their eternal battle. Sometimes you craft funeral fans, sometimes you repair offerings burned in rain rituals, and once you are asked to make a fan for the emperor's jaguar, priest one that can be thrown on the fire at the end of a sacrifice. You work 3 days on it, and when you hand it over, you watch it disappear in smoke. Minutes later, but you do not regret the effort, because featherwork was never about keeping it, was about transforming. And sometimes you whisper as the plumes catch flame, we are not stitching feathers to cloth, we are stitching the earth to heaven. And you begin to wonder if all our offerings vanish in smoke and time. Is the act of beauty enough to make them endure? The weavers of wind and color, you rise before dawn, not to hunt, but to sort. The workshop is already warm. You unwrap bundles of feathers kept sealed in beeswax cloth to preserve their texture and begin to sift quetzal for emerald, macaw for sapphire, heron for silver sheen. Each feather is laid flat, stroked once, then stacked by size. Today's commission is difficult. A ceremonial fan for a priest who claims to dream of rain. He wants cloud colors, which means white ibis for softness, spotted gull for shadows, and a line of yellow canary to suggest where the sun might be hiding. The challenge is not the color, it's the silence, because featherwork is a craft of absolute stillness. You must not shake the table. You must not exhale too sharply. You must press each feather into beeswax paste in such a way that no glue shows on the feather lies, flush with its neighbors, and the angle catches the light in just the right way. This is not sewing, this is choreography. Each layer a ripple, each shape a suggestion. The finished fan will not move, but it will look as if it might lift off the priest's hand and float upward to meet the gods. The feather masters of Amatlanu VA heard stories of the Amanteco, live deeper in the highlands beyond the stone causeways, near the forests where the quetzal still nests wild. They do not come to market. They do not share their techniques, but their pieces arrive sometimes, carried by traders wrapped in woven mats, headdresses shaped like jaguar heads, caped mantles that ripple like water even when still one piece so finely worked it could be mistaken for a painting was said to contain 2,000 feathers from 27 different birds, layered with such precision that each movement of the wearer made it shift like fire. You saw it once, briefly, at a temple festival. It was carried, not worn, because to wear it would be to change. It and no one dared. Your master called it a tapestry of breath. You believed him, because when it passed you, something in the air shifted as if the workshop itself had exhaled tribute in feathers. As the Aztec Empire grew, so too did the demand for feathers. Tribute lists from conquered cities often demanded not silver, not jade, but feathers, bundles of them, measured by the thousand, sorted by species and color, delivered monthly or yearly to the central warehouses. The tax for one city might read 800 bundles of red macaw feathers, 400 bundles of heron, down 40 capes adorned in quetzal, one shield covered in hummingbird blue. The flow of feathers became a kind of soft river, silent and constant, and with it came more artisans, more workshops, more hands trained to pluck, sort, clean, layer, and bind. You were no longer rare, but your craft remained sacred, because in an empire so vast, so battle-scarred, so full of ceremony and smoke, there were still things made only for beauty, not to be worn into war, not to frighten enemies, but to remind the gods that the world was still beautiful, and that the people still remembered how to offer sky back to sky. The knife beside the brush, but not all commissions are peaceful. Sometimes a warrior comes into the workshop and requests a headdress of blood plumed in red ibis to honor a fallen brother, or a shield, half black, half yellow, to show the sun and death locked in their eternal battle. Sometimes you craft funeral fans. Sometimes you repair offerings burned in rain rituals, and once you were asked to make a fan for the emperor's jaguar, priest, one that can be thrown on the fire at the end of a sacrifice. You work 3 days on it, and when you hand it over, you watch it disappear in smoke. Minutes later. But you do not regret the effort, because featherwork was never about keeping, it was about transforming, and sometimes you whisper as the plumes catch flame. We are not stitching feathers to cloth. We are stitching the earth to heaven. And you begin to wonder if all our offerings vanish in smoke and time. Is the act of beauty enough to make them endure? Plumes in the ashes, you are working when they arrive. You don't hear the ships, but the rumors drift in faster than birds. Pale men, with metal skin and thunder, bearded, loud, sweating under the sun. They do not speak no ottal, they point, they shout, they take dart at first. You think it has nothing to do with you. You are a feather worker, you serve temples, not armies, you sow light, not pain. But soon enough the orders change, the temple closes. The noble patrons vanish, the priests go silent, the tribute no longer flows, the bird sellers disappear. And one morning a Spaniard walks into your workshop, points at the plumes, and says in halting speech, make ... gift for ... king. The feathered gift for Spain. They want a shield, but not to be used to be sent. You are given your finest feathers and told to make something impressive. You choose gold macaw, green parrot, a ring of blue cotinga. You sew carefully, too carefully, perhaps for something that will leave and never return. It is called the Moctezuma headdress, though no one knows if you ever wore it. It is large, circular, radiant, the kind of object that makes you quiet. Just by looking at it, it leaves on a ship, it will eventually sit in a museum half a world away. But when you made it, you were still thinking like an Amanteca, still stitching the earth to the sky, even as the sky began to fall. After the fall, the workshops are closed now. The birds, once revered, are hunted for food. The young no longer learn the names of each feather's curve and shine. The clay pots of Tizikli are emptied. The bone combs lie unused. You keep your brushes in a box under your sleeping mat. Sometimes you take them out, not to work but to remember. A fan, a shield, a story, a quetzal tale laid like a question mark across your lap. There are still some who ask for feathers for church banners, perhaps, or for trade. But the layering, the meaning, is gone. Only the shimmer remains. And sometimes you wonder if no one remembers what the feathers meant. Do they still shine the same way? Legacy. Of color centuries pass, your name is lost, but one of your pieces survives. Maybe it was kept. Maybe it was buried. Maybe it was taken by someone who couldn't bear to burn it. It lies now in a glass case, far from where you were born. Scholars argue over its origin. Visitors press their faces to the glass. They do not know the language of feathers. They do not see the brush strokes hidden in the seams, but the color still catches the light, and in that flash of green and gold, something very old stirs, a memory of a world where birds taught people how to speak to gods, where every gift was stitched with silence, and where the sky could be sewn softly back into itself. Even a feather, placed just right, can carry the weight of a world. And as the last rays of the day slant across the dusty floor of your now empty workshop, you think, maybe the gods don't need words anymore. Maybe they just need color, and someone to remember where it came from. Keeping heaven's schedule, summer rains begin just before dawn. You wake not to thunder, but to the whisper of water on tiles, slow and steady. You sit up on your woven mat, light the oil lamp, and reach for your bamboo slips. You do not yawn, you do not sigh. Instead, with the care of someone balancing a temple scale, you dip your brush into ink and write. 5th month, 23rd day. Rain began in the hour of tiger, steady, no wind. Then you pause, listen again, make a note. Ground still dry, rain absorbed. Croaking of frogs, audible from West Canal. You place the slip into its tray. You have been doing this for 19 years, and you are not a weatherman. You are a bureaucrat. Why the empire watched the sky in ancient China, especially during the Han and Tang dynasties? Weather was not a curiosity, it was a message. Rain and drought, frost and windies were communications from heaven, signs of favor or disapproval. An emperor's virtue was believed to affect the balance of natural forces. Too much rain, perhaps the ruler had neglected the people. A withered harvest, perhaps a corrupt minister had angered the heavens. So the empire watched and recorded every day. In every province. And at the center of this watchful web were men like Humanar clerks, appointed to government posts, charged with observing the skies, not interpreting them, just watching. Writing, waiting. The man and the mandate too were not born into this. You came from a merchant family in Luoyang, quiet, bookish, steady. At 22 you passed the local exam, not the top tier, but high enough for a post in records. You hoped for something in taxation or court copywork. Instead, you were sent north to a mountain district as a Tianwen Shire sky clerk. Your job to write down when it rained, and not just when, how much, how long, from which direction the clouds came, what it smelled like, how birds behaved, how people responded. You began with skepticism. Rain is rain, you thought, but then you started to notice. The quality of rain shifted with the month. Rain in early spring came with a metallic scent like cold stones in a bowl. Rain in midsummer was heavier, stickier, with frogs and cicadas responding like clockwork. Autumn rains were brief, then gained more memory than weather, and so you began to write more than required, not just rain. Hour of snake, but rain fine and silk-threaded. The bamboo leaves caught droplets like coins, smell of loam. Children's sandals left at gateposts. One crow sheltering on temple roof. No one told you to write these things, but no one told you not to, and over time your records grew. Vivid. Not poetic. Just precise. As if you were building a portrait of water one day at a time. The archives of drizzle you stored each month's slips in clay jars, tied with string and labeled with ink. You sent summaries to the prefecture each quarter. Average rainfall, river height, moisture patterns, crop impact estimates. Other clerks wrote shorter reports, but yours were known, sometimes passed around. Your supervisor once told you, your rain slips are strange, but strangely useful. You smiled because you'd begun to suspect something. That rain does not simply fall, it leaves trails in behavior, in speech, in how people gather firewood, or how long children stay outside. And you were no longer just writing weather, you were writing habits. And beneath those habits, maybe even truth. And as you sealed another bundle of bamboo slips, the rain still falling outside, you wondered if heaven speaks through rain. What else might it be trying to say? Reading the sky, writing the land. It's the 8th year of your appointment. The plum rains have come early this summer, saturating the lower terraces, swelling the canals, turning footpaths into soft lines of mud. Your desk is crowded with slips, rain tallies, flood warnings, tributary logs. But this morning, something new is added to the pile. A petition from a village elder. The rains came too heavy, the barley drowned. We ask for leniency in tax. The records will prove it, and they are not wrong. You open your ledger. 4th month, 6 days of rainfall recorded. 5th month, 11 days. Note, saturation reached on 5th day, flooding in lower fields. Barley collapse likely. The elder's case is strong, and you who once thought of rain as water and inconvenience now understand its weight. The emperor's mirror under the mandate of heaven. The emperor is not only ruler but reflection. If the land suffers, the throne must answer. This is why your records matter. A single bad harvest, forgivable. But 3 years of erratic rain. That's more than agriculture. That's warning. And so your scrolls climb beyond the local outpost sent to the provincial governor, then to the Ministry of Works, and sometimes all the way to the imperial astronomer who combines your notes with solar eclipses, river ice logs, and star positions. From these fragments, they divine heaven's mood and they make decisions, sometimes quietly, sometimes With great ceremony, you remember the year the court declared a fasting period after drought. The emperor appeared in plain robes, offered rice at the altar of earth, and read aloud a written confession not for any crime, but for governing poorly enough that the rain had fled. People wept, and later that month, it rained again. You copied that entry yourself. 7th month, day of goat. Clouds gathered after royal atonement. Light rain fell. Citizens burned incense. You didn't editorialize, but in your private slip that night, you added, the frogs sang louder than I've heard all year. An accidental chronicler's pass. Your ink grows steadier. Your notes become the envy of other districts. Scribes borrow them during monsoon seasons. Monks copy passages. One visiting scholar from Chang'an remarks, half joking, you have written the biography of rainfall, and you realize it's true. You now have 24 clay jars full of slips. They smell faintly of mold, incense, and damp wood, and yet inside them is an invisible architecture, a map of how a people lived around water. You begin sorting the entries not just by date, but by effect. Heavy rain, roads impassable, gives increase in temple offerings for protection. Drought 5th month gives well depths measured twice daily. Prayer services doubled. Unexpected mist gives sail delays. Market postponed. You are beginning to see patterns not in the sky, but in people. Because rain, it turns out, is not only a divine message, it is a mirror, and your notes are no longer just duty, they are memory. The value of detail. One afternoon, a young clerk arrives sent from the capital for training. He studies your scrolls, frowns, and says, you write too much. You smile. He asks why you bother noting frog croaks, the smell of stone, whether chickens returned early to their coops. You reply, because one day someone might forget what rain felt like. He doesn't understand, not yet, but you hope he will, because the empire records what it must, and the rest is left to men like you, observers, witnesses, not of great wars or royal triumphs, but of the soft, ordinary water that holds the world together. And as you record the hour of today's first drop, you wonder if the sky remembers US drop by drop. Shouldn't we remember it the same way? When the clouds remembered you back, you are old now. The rains have changed, or maybe it's the land, or you. Your brush no longer moves as fast. Your knees ache in the cold, but still, each time you hear the first patter of rain on the eaves, your fingers reach for the ink. Out of habit, out of ritual, out of something that feels very close to love. You no longer serve in an official post. Your appointment ended 3 summers ago. A younger man to Defied took over. He copies the rainfall totals with precision. He submits his reports promptly. His handwriting is excellent, but he does not write how the air smells before a storm, or how the plum trees bend under their own weight, or how the old frogs emerge like ghosts from under the porch. So now, you write for yourself, and for the rain. The sky has scrawled you. They begun transcribing your old records, carefully transferring the slips to silk-backed scrolls. Not just the rain logs, but the margins too, the musings, the small notations you once thought silly. Rain and peach blossoms together. Children wore no shoes. Mist thick, sound of a zither in the distance. Possibly temple festival. Rain stopped, but roofs still weep. You arrange them not chronologically, but by feeling. Early rains, sudden rains, grief, rain, celebration. Rain. The sky, it seems, had moods, and you've spent your life learning its grammar. What began as a civil obligation has become something softer, a companion text to weather, a glossary of how water teaches patience. You do not expect anyone to read it, but still, you write because if you stop, who else will remember that the first spring rain in the year of the crane sounded like rice being poured into a basket? A visit from the capital. One morning, a messenger arrives. Young, nervous, a scholar. He bows, produces a scroll, and explains. The Ministry of Rights is compiling a natural almanac. They've heard of your records, may they consult them. You nod. You prepare tea. He is respectful. He spends 3 days in your study, poring over the jars. At night, he asks you questions. At dawn, you walk together by the river. On his last morning, as he prepares to leave, he says, Master Liu, I thought I came here to study rain, but what you've written, it's the story of how people bend toward it. You are quiet. Then you say, rain doesn't just fall. It stays in the soil, in the memory, in what we plant next. He bows, and leaves, and you sit in your doorway. That evening, listening, it is not raining, but the frogs are singing anyway. The final entry. You do not know when your last day will come, so each morning you write as though it might be today. You prepare your ink, straighten your papers, light your lamp. And even when the skies are clear, you sometimes write, no rain, but the air is listening, because you have come to believe something, that perhaps heaven didn't choose you to write about rain. Perhaps it sent the rain to give you something worth writing, and that even when you are gone, the clouds will still pass over this place. And someone, maybe no one, might still look up and wonder who once loved the sky enough to listen to every drop.